We can start our. Okay, great. Again, my name is David Plum, and you'll see me throughout the meeting helping to facilitate and guide today's meeting. I have some colleagues, Charlotte and RT and Mira and others, who are helping to do the tech and make sure we work well today online. So to kick us off in this meeting of the task force, Dave Diamond is here from BOEM. He's Deputy Chief of Atlantic Operations at BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Program. So Dave Diamond will kick us off today in our meeting of the task force. So over to you, Dave.
Oh, thank you, David. And good morning, and thank you all for joining us for the Central Atlantic Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force meeting. I want to give a special thank you to our task force members that have prepared presentations and have contributed to the planning of this meeting. This task force and others like it that BOEM has established all around the country are critically important to help us identify areas on the outer continental shelf that hold the greatest promise for offshore wind development. Thank you also to members of the public for joining to observe the meeting. We have dedicated time on day 2 for a public feedback opportunity to hear from you. We take your feedback very seriously and are grateful in advance for your input. And 2 other important thank yous. Thank you to the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI, for their facilitation and support. And thank you to the BOEM team for hosting and organizing the meeting. While everyone on the BOEM team has done a fantastic job, I want to give particular kudos to Seth Thierkoff, who is our BOEM lead for the Central Atlantic 2 planning effort and did an incredible job helping pull this meeting together. Next, I'd like to provide some background and context really on why we're here this morning. We recognize that there are a broad range of offshore wind activities occurring in the region, but we want to be clear that our primary focus for this meeting for the next 2 days will be on planning activities ahead of a potential second Central Atlantic offshore wind lease sale. We recently published the first step of this multi-year planning process in late August. The call for information and nominations, or as we'll refer to it, the call. The call serves as an opportunity for us to take a broad look at the Central Atlantic region and to gain as much information as possible ahead of further narrowing the area of consideration as we seek to deconflict any future lease areas. Some of you that are familiar with BOEM's activities might wonder why we're starting a second round of planning for additional lease areas in the Central Atlantic region so soon after our first Central Atlantic offshore wind lease sale, which just happened last month. There are several goals motivating the start of this planning process now. The Biden-Harris administration has ambitious goals to see the nation deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating deepwater offshore wind energy by 2035 to support efforts to combat climate change. Further, the Central Atlantic states have indicated to BOEM a need for additional offshore wind lease areas in order to achieve their state-level offshore wind goals. However, we recognize how busy the coastal ocean is, and that the coastal ocean in the Central Atlantic region is among the busiest in the nation, with a wide range of fishing, maritime, national security, and other activities and resources ongoing throughout the region. Not only are these areas busy, but they are also places that we care deeply about. We recognize the coastal communities up and down the Central Atlantic coastline have meaningful connections with their adjacent ocean, including cultural heritages and livelihoods. And thus, we must be mindful of this as we begin this round of planning for additional offshore wind lease areas in the Central Atlantic region by taking a broad look at the region. I also want to emphasize that we're fortunate to be building our planning process on a strong foundation. While one of the primary purposes of the call is to seek new information, we also recognize the significant amount of information that the task force and public has already provided to BOEM in the Central Atlantic region through a recent planning effort that led to the August 2024 lease sale. BOEM plans to build on this foundation of information as we begin planning for Central Atlantic 2, including building upon the spatial model developed by our partners at NOAA's National Center for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS, which informed the first round of planning for the Central Atlantic. Our goal for the next 2 days is to respectfully share information, including perspectives and presentations from tribes, federal and state agency partners, as well as state and local elected officials. Information shared will range from states' offshore wind energy goals to resource concerns and ocean uses that must be accounted for in the offshore wind planning process. We anticipate that information gained through our discussions, as well as the current open formal written comment period on the call, will guide BOEM as we move towards the next milestones of this planning process, identification of draft wind energy areas, or WIAs. So before I turn things over to the CBI facilitation team, I'd like to thank everyone again for attending today's meeting and to emphasize a few very important points. I want to reaffirm BOEM's commitment to work closely with task force members as we explore further opportunities for offshore wind development in the Central Atlantic. We also look forward to discussing next steps in the multi-year journey ahead from the broad call area stage that we are in now to the eventual proposal for specific lease areas. We're committed to maintaining open and transparent communication with all ocean users and stakeholders. We want to hear what you have to say. We will have multiple touch points along the way, providing opportunities for the task force and broader public to review what is being proposed and to provide feedback. I look forward to working with you all now and in the future. Thank you. And now back over to David Plum with CBI to facilitate our tribal introductions and perspective session.
Super. Thanks so much, Dave. And thanks for those opening comments. Wonderful. So for those of you who had been through perhaps a previous task force meeting, whether in Central Atlantic or elsewhere, you know we often start creating an opportunity if we have members from tribes here and tribal representatives, if they'd like to offer some opening words or reflections before we continue on with our meeting. So I'll just open up the floor to say if we have members here from tribes who would like to offer some words, please feel free to raise your hand. Charlotte will make sure that your mic can be opened. So let me just pause for a second. If we do have any members of tribes, and I have a hard time on my screen seeing who's here right now because there's 63 of you in this main meeting space right now. But let me just pause and say any tribal members here who would like to offer some opening words, now's a moment. Of course, tribes, like all the folks in the call here today, can contribute throughout this meeting. Let me pause. Okay. I'm not seeing hands from folks from tribes who would like to offer some words. Charlotte, please chime in if you see something I don't see. Okay. Thanks. Okay. Great. Again, in this main meeting space, folks will have time for discussion, questions, etc., throughout our 2 days together. Wonderful. All right, let me say a few things about our 2 days together that we're going to do. And let me walk through a few opening slides. However, before I do that, I think it would be interesting to get a sense of who's in the room. I can see on my screen we have 62 or 63 people in this sort of main part of the meeting. In the Zoom language, that's panelists in this webinar. And then we've got another 124 people who are observing our meeting today. And Charlotte's prepared a couple, just two Zoom polls to get a sense of who's actually in the room right now. So Charlotte, if you're able to run those polls now, that would be great. And just feel free to answer them. This is for the panelists and the attendees, task force members, and folks who are just observing. Everyone can take the poll. You can see it's very simple. It's like, where are you calling in from today? Or where do you consider your home state? And then the second one, what best describes your affiliation? So let's just give that a moment. Everybody, please chime in, click on the poll. It'll be interesting to know who's in the room in our meeting today. It says panelists can't vote. Well, that's a shame. I'm not quite sure what happened there, Charlotte, but sometimes the technology gremlins get in there.
I tested it last night and panelists could vote.
I don't know. Is that the same thing everybody's having?
I just changed it. Panelists can vote now.
Okay, panelists, you're in.
Sorry, everyone.
Thanks, Eileen, for doing that heads up. Apologies for the tech. Panelists, jump right in there and vote. Oh, but I think when you did that, it cut off the voting. So why don't we do this? We can share the results of who the attendees are, and then we can do one more if we want to do it again real quick. Okay.
Sure.
So you can see, if you're seeing what I'm seeing, we've got a fairly even distribution of where folks are from, and a fair number of folks who aren't from the 5 states as well. And then if you scroll down, you can see in terms of affiliation, quite a bit of federal government and state government, and a little bit of the rest, and some other among the attendees. That's fascinating. And I think it might be worth to do this one more time. And this one, panelists, you'll be able to vote on this. Folks, task force members, jump right in here and answer these questions real quick. It would be helpful to do this. Thanks for helping out and fixing a little tech glitch here. So if you're a task force member, jump right in and answer this question, if you would, please. These 2 questions. Okay. Just give it a second more here. Okay. Let's share it back. Okay, again, if you're seeing what I'm seeing, a good distribution from across the different states and others. And then in terms of who's here, heavy emphasis on federal government, state government, a little bit of local government and county, a little bit of conservation organization. Again, I can see some folks mixing in from the attendees as well, and the wind industry as well. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you for that. And I think it's important. I think one of the takeaways from that for me is we have good distribution across the states, and that's helpful to know. All right, let me walk through some of the things we'll be doing today. Our objective, as is the case with these intergovernmental renewable energy task force, is to facilitate coordination and consultation and some information sharing. As Dave Diamond mentioned, we are focusing specifically on this Central Atlantic 2 planning process, right? There's a lot going on in the Central Atlantic. All those other activities can inform the way we think about this new planning effort. And this meeting is really to wrap everyone's mind around this new effort and how to make sure it is done as effectively, constructively, and appropriately as possible. All right, so that's what we're doing today. We're sharing information. In terms of the task force, I mentioned this earlier. Dave Diamond mentioned this. If you're new to this sort of space of these BOEM task force, they are task force of public officials, federal, tribal, state and local, and there's a mix of some elected officials and administration officials, and it's from the 5 states, right? So it's a fairly significant task force here for the Central Atlantic. What are we going to do today? I'll just put it all out. Today, we're going to have an opening presentation by Seth Tierkoff at BOEM about the planning process, Central Atlantic 2, the starting place for it and where it aims to go. Then we're going to have some state perspectives from the 5 states of how they're looking at this new planning process. And then we're going to have 3 federal partner agencies provide some input of how they're looking at this: NOAA, Fish and Wildlife, and the National Park Service. After each of these presentations, we're going to have some periods for the task force to ask some questions and then offer some comments and thoughts as well. So after each of these, we're going to have some back and forth among those of us here in the main meeting room. Tomorrow, we're going to have a recap of what happened, and then we're going to have 3 other federal agencies offer some thoughts. We're going to have a session that really focuses on some key issues in the planning exercise that Seth Tierkoff and some partners from NOAA are going to lead. Tomorrow as well, we're going to reserve an hour as well for public comment, right? So those of you who are joining us not as task force members, but as members of the public. Tomorrow, we're going to have an hour to do some public feedback. And so stay tuned for that. I put the time on this slide, 11:20 tomorrow. All right. We're not going to do it today. We're going to do it tomorrow. We certainly welcome everybody listening in and encourage you to listen in today as well. And then we'll finish up tomorrow with sort of what happens next, right? Both days, 9 to 1. Our breaks are going to be roughly around 11, a little before, a little after. And as I said, tomorrow will be a public input opportunity. Now, speaking of public input opportunities, and let me just say a little bit about how everyone will be participating both today and then in some future activities as well. Today and tomorrow, task force members, the way you're going to interact with us in the meeting, we'll be asking questions. We'll use the chat for asking questions after we have presentations. And then we're going to verbally just have some discussion, right? And I'll say a little bit more about the managing the chat in a moment, because we are 71 of us here in the main meeting space. Members of the public, your interaction will be listening in. And then tomorrow, an opportunity if you want to provide some input. However, today and tomorrow are not the only activities and engagement that are happening around the front end of this planning process. And if you haven't seen this material already, please go to the website, and maybe Charlotte or someone could drop in the chat this link that I have on the slide here. There will be a sort of roadshow of in-person engagement, open house style meetings starting next week, North Carolina and Virginia, the following week in Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. All those dates and the details and locations are on that website that's linked in this document that and it'll be dropped in the chat shortly. There also will be a virtual public meeting, not task force, but a public meeting on October 2nd, which is an opportunity to provide input for anybody who wishes to join. And then, as Dave Diamond mentioned, the BOEM is an official sort of comment period now on this call for nominations, the call, and you'll hear that jargon today. And that public comment period is open until October 21st. And that's where you go to the Federal Register. And again, there's instructions on BOEM's website about how to get to the right place in the Federal Register to offer your comment. All this is happening in the coming weeks. So there are multiple ways to interact with BOEM and get information and provide input over the coming weeks, including what we're going to do today and tomorrow. Okay. All right. So one more thing before we get going. First of all, we're kind of a big crowd, right? There's 76 of us in the main meeting space. When we do public comment right now, I see 128 folks over there. I don't know what that's going to look like tomorrow. And so for us in the main meeting space today, we're going to need to, when we have discussions, share the floor, right? And share the floor means keep it to just a couple minutes kind of thing. If we want to be letting each other have a chance to ask questions and make some comments. We know that offshore wind is an issue that inspires some pretty significant emotion and feelings and opinion. And it's okay that we can have very different views on this. And that's fine for it to show up in today's meeting and the public input opportunities and everything. What we ask is that you show the respect for others' views that you would want them to show of your views, right? So think about what that means. But basically, we're saying it's okay to have different views, and we need to be respectful in the way we express it, and the way we let others have different opinions than ours. We're going to try to stay on topic on the Central Atlantic 2. If we want to talk about other things that are going on, it should be in the context of how we're learning from those other things and what should happen in Central Atlantic 2. And then one last thing on the chat. We're going to use the chat in the main meeting space for you all to pose some questions after we've had a round of presentation. We don't want the chat to be a place for making comments or going back and forth on opinions and this and that, because that would be a total mess with 70-something of us. So we don't want a parallel conversation in the chat. If you have comments and things, raise your hand during the discussion period, and we'll do that verbally, right? Let's keep the discussion verbal. Use the chat as a way to pose questions after a presentation if you have some specific questions. And I'll leave it to your criteria that your questions are actually questions and not a comment dressed up in a question. All right, that's all from me. Thanks, everyone. I think the next thing is for me to turn it over to Seth Tierkoff from BOEM to walk us through this initial presentation of the Central Atlantic 2 planning process. So Seth, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate that. Just want to confirm that you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect.
Thanks.
All righty. Well, thanks for that introduction, David, and thank you all for joining today. My name is Seth Tierkoff, and I am a project coordinator with BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. And as has been shared, I am BOEM's lead for the second round of planning for offshore wind lease areas in the Central Atlantic region, referred to as our Central Atlantic 2 planning process. I also want to acknowledge that there are several colleagues of mine from BOEM that have joined as well, and they will be supporting the Q&A and discussion session today and throughout the meeting over the next 2 days. So today's presentation is really going to focus on a few key areas related to the Central Atlantic 2 process. I'm going to begin with some information on the drivers, or what's really sort of promoting this round of planning. I'm then going to provide some information on BOEM's offshore wind lease planning process to get us onto the same page with how that process works. I'm then going to provide some information on what is contained within the call for information nominations. That's the first step of this planning process for Central Atlantic 2 that was recently published. And then we're going to round it out today with some information on next steps and timing. That'll be a little bit of a primer of what we'll share in more detail tomorrow in the next steps session. So next slide, David. Okay, and before we really dig into the presentation today, I just really wanted to provide some information and background on who BOEM is and what our mission is. So our elected officials and agency leaders at the national and state levels have identified offshore wind energy development as a priority for the nation. That includes the Biden-Harris administration's goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, as well as the various states' offshore wind energy goals. So where does BOEM come into this picture? So BOEM, as a federal agency within the Department of Interior, is tasked with the mission of facilitating responsible development of renewable energy through sound planning, engagement, analysis, and review. And so at the top of the meeting, similar to what David shared, we want to recognize that there's a wide range of opinions on offshore wind energy, and we respect that there are going to be varied perspectives on this topic. However, the focus of this presentation is really going to be to provide you all with an update on BOEM's leasing activities as they relate to the Central Atlantic 2 process, and to discuss and hear from you about the call for information and nominations so that your feedback can refine and improve our process. Next slide. And so I represent BOEM's Office of Renewable Energy Programs, which operates our renewable energy leasing process that you see on the slide here. And so this process really begins with the lease planning and analysis phase, which if you click again, David, that's that portion that's contained within the red box here. And so that phase of the process is really going to be the focus of our discussion today. And we're going to break that process down in greater detail in subsequent slides. So lease planning and analysis efforts are intended to inform development of offshore wind lease areas for an eventual auction. And what's important to note here is that once a lessee holds a lease, there are multiple phases and stages of requirements, including site assessments and surveys and development of plans that require environmental and technical reviews prior to any possible project's construction on the Outer Continental Shelf. So again, for today's discussion, we're really going to focus on the portion of our process in that red box that is the lease planning and analysis phase. And that's really where we're at in the Central Atlantic 2 process. So we're going to explain this process in the context of the Central Atlantic 2 process that's ahead of us. Next slide. So in April of this year, the Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, announced a new 5-year offshore wind leasing schedule, which is what you see on the screen here. This 5-year schedule is intended to provide an outlook of offshore wind lease sales that BOEM is planning to hold within the upcoming 5-year period. And that's intended to serve as a resource to provide transparency to ocean stakeholders on offshore wind lease planning efforts that are on the horizon. So what leases and lease sales are anticipated to be on the horizon, as well as certainty to the offshore wind industry and supply chain regarding additional projects that will be on the horizon in various regions. So what's important to note on this graphic as it relates to the Central Atlantic Task Force are that 2 lease sales in the Central Atlantic region are noted. The first of which occurred on August 14th of this year, about a month ago, and that we're going to describe on the next slide. The second of which is the Central Atlantic 2 lease sale that's shown in the red box here, and that is anticipated to occur in mid-2026. Next slide. So BOEM's most recent round of lease planning in the Central Atlantic region, which we refer to here on this slide as Central Atlantic 1, resulted in the lease sale that occurred last month in August. So multiple ocean user and natural resource conflicts limited the identification of suitable acreage for offshore wind lease areas, but ultimately 2 lease areas were identified and were included in the lease sale. That includes lease area OCSA 0557. That's the area offshore Maryland, Delaware. Yep, right there. As well as lease area 0558, which is adjacent to the Coastal Virginia offshore wind project off of Virginia. So advancement of these 2 new lease areas is supportive of reaching the Central Atlantic states' offshore wind goals. But we know that these new lease areas, combined with the existing lease areas in the region, is not sufficient to fully meet several Central Atlantic states' offshore wind energy goals. Next slide. So in late 2023 and early 2024, the states of Maryland and North Carolina expressed concerns to BOEM regarding the need for additional lease areas to meet their respective states' offshore wind energy goals. And so in response to those indications of interest, BOEM held exploratory conversations in early 2024 with Central Atlantic states regarding a possible second round of planning for additional lease areas in the Central Atlantic region. Through those conversations, the following drivers, which are captured in this table on the slide here, were identified. So North Carolina has indicated interest in seeking 3 gigawatts of remaining capacity to meet their goal, and the state expressed interest in exploring the full outer continental shelf offshore of North Carolina beyond Cape Hatteras, which was the original southern planning boundary for the Central Atlantic 1 effort. Virginia expressed that through the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, as well as the lease area that was included in the recent lease sale, their needs as it relates to their state's offshore wind energy goal are likely satisfied. Maryland, seeking 1.5 to 4 gigawatts of additional lease area, expressed interest in exploring areas further to the north of the original Central Atlantic 1 planning area boundary of Delaware Bay, as well as the deep water call areas from Central Atlantic 1. We'll discuss that a little bit further in terms of what that means in the next several slides. Delaware has also, go back, David. So Delaware has also recently rolled out legislation, which was in fact signed into law yesterday by Governor John Carney, which allows for the procurement of up to 1.2 gigawatts of offshore wind. So given the interest in expanding the planning for Central Atlantic 2 northward of Delaware Bay to include areas off of southern New Jersey, specifically in between the Central Atlantic 1 call areas and the New York Bight call area, BOEM has folded New Jersey into the Central Atlantic conversations. So BOEM acknowledges that Central Atlantic 2 is not likely to result in sufficient additional lease acreage to fully meet the remaining portion of New Jersey's 11 gigawatt goal. However, power from future lease areas potentially identified off of New Jersey could potentially be procured by New Jersey or any other adjacent state. Next slide. So given the known high levels of ocean use and natural resource conflict within the Central Atlantic region, BOEM has begun the Central Atlantic 2 process through publication of a broad call for information nominations with a broad call area that you see on the screen here to really gain as much information as possible ahead of removal of areas through subsequent stages of the process. The next few slides, we'll talk through what those actual stages of the process are. This broad call area approach, as was shared by Dave Diamond in his opening remarks, is really intended to build upon that foundation of information and feedback that BOEM has already received through the first round of planning in the Central Atlantic region. And we're going to share more in this presentation and subsequent sessions on sort of how we envision that working. So BOEM's call area for Central Atlantic 2 is intended to be as broad as possible, with the only removals including areas with restrictions around offshore wind energy development. So that includes areas like national marine sanctuaries, existing traffic separation schemes or fairways, or existing BOEM lease areas. In terms of boundaries for what you're seeing on the screen here, in terms of boundaries for the call area, those include to the north, as I shared earlier, an advancement north of that original boundary of Delaware Bay to meet the southern boundary of the New York Bight call areas. So that's inclusive of area off of southern New Jersey. To the south, an expansion from Cape Hatteras to the area that is roughly aligned with the North Carolina-South Carolina border offshore of North Carolina. To the east, we've applied a 60-meter depth contour boundary, which is the maximum depth limit for installation of fixed foundations for offshore wind turbines. And then to the west, we've applied a boundary of 3 nautical miles from the coast, which is the federal state waters line. And the intent here, again, is to gain as much information as possible within this broad area at this stage of our process ahead of area removals towards eventual lease areas. Next slide. Okay, so this next set of slides is intended to conceptually convey BOEM's offshore wind lease planning process and the various steps of it that results in reductions in area as we move through it towards final lease areas. So as has been shared, BOEM has begun the Central Atlantic 2 planning process with a call for information and nominations, which is the first step that's required by BOEM's regulations. It's important to note here that there are 2 optional steps that were not formally included in the Central Atlantic 2 process. That includes the planning area and request for interest, or RFI, area stages. So the planning area stage is intended to identify a broad area within a focal region that may be suitable for offshore wind development. In an RFI area, that stage of the process is intended to gauge specific competitive commercial interest in development of renewable energy resources within a focal area. So the broad call area approach that we have taken for this round of planning is roughly akin to that concept of a planning area, with the exception of the limited area removals that have occurred to date. Similarly, the recent lease sale in the Central Atlantic region provides evidence of a history of competitive commercial interest in development of renewable energy resources in the region. And so thus BOEM began the process for Central Atlantic 2 with a call for information and nominations. So what is a call? So the purpose of a call is to request comments on areas for special consideration and analysis, information on conditions in the call area, as well as an opportunity for expressions of interest from industry in areas to be considered for leasing. That's the nominations process, and we'll explain that even further in a subsequent slide. So during the public comment period for the call, we received comments from the task force, such as through the meeting that we're holding today and tomorrow, the public, and various stakeholder groups. And what's important to note is that information that we receive through the call comment period, through task force meetings, is really what we use to further hone that call area towards draft wind energy areas. Next slide. And so from information that we receive through the call, as well as further analysis to consider other ocean users and to reduce conflicts, we arrive at draft wind energy areas, or WEAs. And so BOEM has adopted a policy of publishing draft wind energy areas for public review and comment before their finalization. And so for Central Atlantic 2, BOEM anticipates following this process and including an opportunity for public comment and additional engagement on those draft wind energy areas to seek feedback and input on them. Based on that input and feedback, BOEM will then work to finalize and publish the WEAs. And those final WEAs, what they actually represent is a portion of the Outer Continental Shelf that's been identified by BOEM for subsequent National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, analysis. And what's also important to note here is that those WEAs represent the basis for subsequent lease areas. Next slide. So those identified wind energy areas have the potential for further division into lease areas. And so those lease areas represent specific areas on the outer continental shelf that can be subject to an auction and subject to a potential future development of renewable energy projects, depending upon BOEM review and environmental analysis, that other stage of the process that I showed on that graphic on an earlier slide. What you can hopefully see through this process, through these subsequently narrowing and decreasing in size boxes, is that there is a continuous reduction in area as this process moves forward to reduce conflicts towards the most compatible lease areas. Next slide. And so BOEM has partnered with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. We've heard a little bit about that already today, but we've partnered with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, or NCOS, which houses a program focused on marine spatial planning. And that partnership is really focused on utilizing best available science and data through spatial modeling to inform WIA identification. And so for those of you that are familiar with the Central Atlantic 1 planning process, BOEM and NCOS are planning to partner and build upon the spatial model that was developed to inform that planning process. And that model was largely built upon feedback that we received through that Central Atlantic 1 planning process. So working from that broad call area footprint that I shared earlier and folding in many different mapped data layers representing a broad range of concerns, uses, and resources that have been identified to date, as well as those that we anticipate being communicated through the currently open comment period, NOAA NCOS will be supporting BOEM to further develop that spatial model to help inform wind energy area identification. Along those lines, I wanted to also raise that the current data being considered for use in the spatial modeling process is located on BOEM's Central Atlantic website, and it's referenced in the Federal Register notice. And we welcome feedback and input on those data that are under consideration. We also expect that public input during the comment period, which is open now, as well as feedback that we've received to date, will help to inform that modeling and ultimately inform the decisions that are made on draft wind energy areas. And again, BOEM is committed to ensuring that those draft wind energy areas are made available for public review. In our next step session later tomorrow, you're going to hear more about the plans for that. Next slide. So on this slide and the next several slides, I really want to provide some insights into what is contained within that call for information and nominations Federal Register notice, and to highlight specific areas where BOEM is requesting your input and feedback. One important element of the call is the provision of an overview of feedback from the Central Atlantic 1 planning process. And again, the intent here is to really build upon all of that great input and feedback that's been provided by many folks as part of that Central Atlantic 1 process. So that includes within that Federal Register notice, a review of input related to recreational and commercial fisheries, marine habitats and natural resources, protected species, industry, and navigation considerations. So in addition, again, to that information that's contained within the Federal Register notice, I encourage you all to take a look at the BOEM Central Atlantic webpage. We have a series of maps like the one you see on the screen here that are intended to show some of that feedback in terms of specific areas that we're aware of from past feedback that we're considering as this process moves forward. The main action item that I want to share here for you all is that the currently open comment period really provides an opportunity for both new feedback as well as updates, revisions, or expansion of past feedback, given that broadened geographic scope of the call area, as well as the potential development or availability of new data that should be considered in the planning process. Next slide. So in addition to that reflection on past feedback that BOEM is aware of and considering as part of the Central Atlantic 2 planning process, we also include a series of questions that seek information on very specific considerations. And so, for example, we seek information on historic properties and visual and scenic resources, including recommendations on minimum distances between the coastline and lease areas. We have some information from past comments that have been provided, but we welcome additional input in areas such as this. Other areas that we're seeking information include information related to tribal nations in the region, such as potential impacts to tribal cultural heritage practices, lands, treaty rights, and other considerations, as well as information on transmission planning considerations, information on size and number of WIAs, as well as auction formats, just to name a few areas of information that are specifically requested in the call for information and nominations. Next slide. So the call also provides an opportunity for potential offshore wind developers to nominate specific areas of interest within the Central Atlantic region for possible commercial wind energy leasing. So in terms of specific areas where nominations will be accepted, that includes the Central Atlantic 2 call area. That's that broad near shore area that I indicated on an earlier slide, as well as the Central Atlantic 1 call areas E and F. So that's the deep water areas that you can see on the map here. Those are the areas further offshore to the western, eastern portion of the map that you see here. And so BOEM deferred a decision on identification of any wind energy areas or lease areas within those deep water call areas through the Central Atlantic 1 planning process. And through the Central Atlantic 2 planning process is providing an opportunity to seek developer nominations for these areas, as well as additional information on these areas to inform their potential further consideration as the planning process proceeds. BOEM intends to publish nominations that are received through the call in an aggregated view on the BOEM website, similar to the map that you see here. And that information will be used as one resource among many others as BOEM moves to advance and inform draft wind energy areas. Next slide. So in terms of the timeline for the Central Atlantic 2 leasing effort, the next major milestone is identification of draft wind energy areas. That is expected by the first quarter of 2025. So that'll be the next milestone of this process, which will be informed by the information we receive through the task force meeting, through the currently open call period, as well as development and refinement of the spatial model with NOAA and costs. We really intend to conduct a series of engagement meetings on those draft WIAs. So there will be further meetings to provide information on those draft WIAs to gain feedback, to gain input, which we will share a little bit more about in the next steps session tomorrow. And the intent there is to gain feedback on those draft wind energy areas prior to their finalization as final wind energy areas in the third quarter of 2025. From there, we anticipate the next steps being related to the lease sale in late 2025 and 2026. So that'll include the proposed sale notice in quarter 4 of 2025, development of a final sale notice by quarter 1 of 2026, and an intent to hold a second lease sale in quarter 2 of 2026. Next slide. And before I close out this presentation, I just really wanted to touch on the additional opportunities that are on the horizon for engagement on the call. So the task force is certainly an important touch point. We really appreciate you all joining again to provide your perspective and to learn more about this process through the task force meeting. In addition, we'll be holding in-person engagement meetings, open house style meetings the next 2 weeks, beginning in North Carolina and ending in New Jersey. Beyond that, we will also be holding a virtual public meeting on October 2nd. And then the written comment period, as has been shared, is open now through October 21st. So for more information on all of that, the link that's on this slide here will get you to more information on those meetings. Okay, and that's all I have for now. Thank you, David.
All right, thanks, Seth. Okay, so that's a sort of high-level overview of what's going on in the Central Atlantic 2 process. We have a time for some questions and then some comments. And I think what I want to try to do is model with Seth's presentation how we're going to handle it with the state's presentations and the federal agency presentations, which is, let's first, if you have a question for Seth, your task force member, you could go ahead and drop that question in the chat. And thanks, Colleen, for the question about can we link for the map. Maybe someone from BOEM here could drop that link in the chat to answer Colleen's question. If folks have a question for Seth, go ahead and drop that right in the chat right now. And let's see what kind of questions we get for Seth and the BOEM team on the Central Atlantic 2 process. And then we'll have a chance, if you want to raise your hand and ask and say a comment, or you have some feedback for Seth, feel free to raise your hand and do that as well. But I'm interested to see if folks have any questions for Seth, and let's try to collect some of those questions in the chat so we have a register of them. And thanks, Seth, for dropping that link in the chat. Yep, and I'm just watching the chat. Probably you all are too. I see Douglas's question about, assume that when we have DoD, the Department of Defense, tomorrow, we'll talk about deconflicting military mission capacity planning. Seth, do you just want to say a word about the sort of the overall process with DoD and what to expect tomorrow in their presentation?
Absolutely. So we're coordinated very closely with the Department of Defense's siting clearinghouse. They're our main point of contact with the Department of Defense for assessment at the siting stage of our process. And so we've been coordinating with them on a monthly basis in terms of providing information on the Central Atlantic 2 process. But the Department of Defense's siting clearinghouse has a formal assessment that's underway. So they are assessing the call area as it relates to mission compatibility. That is anticipated to occur now. It's been actually ongoing for a little while through the end of October. And we're going to have the lead for the executive director for the siting clearinghouse, Mr. Steve Sample, presenting tomorrow on that process and how we're coordinating with the DoD. So I encourage folks to join tomorrow for that session to learn more about that process.
Thanks, Seth. That's great. I dropped the slides so that we can just see each other a little bit better, and feel happy to bring them back up if there's something you want to reference in Seth's slides. I'm curious, task force members, if you have a comment for Seth that you want to offer, feel free to raise your hand. And so there should be a button down at the very bottom of your Zoom screen that says raise hand. It should be there. That's our signal that Charlotte can go in and make sure you can open up your mic. And I see that Senator Caruso has a hand up. So let me turn to you, Senator. And Charlotte, can you make sure the Senator can open up her mic? Senator, go ahead.
Good morning, and I want to thank BOEM and the team for hosting these virtual meetings today and tomorrow. My question was, and I tried to do it in chat, but it might have gone directly to someone else. Since Seth in his presentation did mention the Central Atlantic Area 1, and I just wanted to understand it because it seemed like he alluded to there was still a process there for continual feedback. So I just want to make sure, I know we're focused on the Central Atlantic Area, Call Area 2, but since you did mention Call Area 1, I just wanted to understand where we were with that process.
Thank you for that question, Senator Caruso. So in terms of that, so within the Central Atlantic 2 call for information and nominations, we're currently considering really two areas. So the first is this broadened call area. That's that area between 3 nautical miles and the 60-meter depth contour and areas off of New Jersey down to the southern boundary of North Carolina. So that is sort of the shallow water area. That's the primary focus for Central Atlantic 2. The state of Maryland indicated, as far as the Central Atlantic 1 process goes, there are deep water areas, areas that are as deep as 2,000 meters deep, that were part of the Central Atlantic 1 process that BOEM ultimately deferred a decision on. We didn't identify any wind energy areas or ultimate lease areas within those deeper water areas further offshore. And so as part of Central Atlantic 2, we've included an opportunity for nominations as well as additional information to inform whether or not those areas will be further considered as part of the Central Atlantic 2 planning process. So hopefully that helps. It's maybe a little bit confusing there, but we're just trying to be able to provide an opportunity to gain some additional information on those areas prior to making a decision on whether to advance or not advance those areas further in the process.
Thanks, Seth. Senator, was that clear enough in terms of that relationship? Hang on one second, you're on mute, just jump off. Because indeed, it is a little confusing about those far offshore spaces and what the story is in this time around.
Okay, so just to clarify, we had areas in call area 1 impacting Maryland that could then be in play for call area 2. Is that what I'm hearing? Or I guess I was also trying to find out if some of the other issues with call area 1 were still being reviewed.
Thank you for that. So in terms of the Central Atlantic 1 process, there were 6 distinct call areas that were explored. So 4 were nearer to shore, as well as those 2 deeper water areas that were further offshore. For those 4 areas that were nearer to shore, BOEM completed its area identification process. So we began several years ago with those broad call areas, and we evaluated and analyzed them all the way through our wind energy area and lease area identification process. So those near shore areas, those specific call areas, they're called areas A through D. Those areas have been fully analyzed and have gone fully through our process. Those deep water areas, areas E and F, those ended at sort of the call area stage as through our Central Atlantic 1 process, and through Central Atlantic 2, we're exploring, whether to further include those and further analyze those as this process moves forward. In terms of the feedback and information that led to the outcomes of the Central Atlantic 1 process, as you're likely familiar, Senator Croza, there's significant military activity in the areas offshore of Maryland and Delaware. There's significant fisheries activity. And so information related to those activities, to existing ocean uses, other natural resource conflicts, that's the type of feedback, that's the type of information that we are carrying forward, and that we're allowing another opportunity for further information at this early stage of the process to ensure we really have all of that information at the table prior to making further decisions on the Central Atlantic 2 call area.
Thanks, Seth. Do others have questions or comments for Seth on this sort of introductory presentation and the overall process for Central Atlantic 2? Anyone else here in the task force have a question for Seth based on this introductory information? Feel free to drop a question in the chat or raise your hand. If you're having a hard time raising your hand, reach out to Charlotte. Okay, great. Excellent. All right, well, after each of these rounds of presentations today, we'll take a pause for task force members to drop some questions in the chat, raise your hand for some comments. So we'll be doing this a couple times as we go forward here. This is great. Why don't we go ahead and switch gears and get into our round of presentations from the states. We gave them something of an impossible task of each of the 5 states give a presentation in 5 to 7 minutes about how they're viewing offshore wind and how it relates to the Central Atlantic 2 process. The good news is we're coming in a little bit early, so we have a little bit extra time. So states, you have a little bit of a reprieve here. So we thank all the states for preparing some presentations. I'm going to go ahead and share the screens. We're going to start with North Carolina. I see Jennifer Munt has her camera on, and we'll probably drop the spotlight on Seth and bring the spotlight on Jennifer. And at some point, we can drop the spotlight off me. But before we get going, let me just say our strategy here is to run the 5 state presentations back to back. And what that means is you may forget the question you had for Jennifer by the time you get to New Jersey. So we encourage you as task force members to jot some notes to yourself if you have some questions, or you can also use the chat if you'd like to throw a question in the chat. Know that the presenters may not be looking at the chat and probably won't answer it in real time. We'll just gather those questions for after all 5 are done. But I don't want you to forget the thoughts or the feedback or the questions you had for the initial presentations, since we're going to put 5 together. Okay. So with that, Jennifer, let me pull the deck open. Give me 1 second to do that, get to the right slide deck, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, David. Can everybody hear me okay?
Sounds good to me.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Seth and the BOEM team, fellow members of the Central Atlantic Renewable Energy Task Force. My name is Jennifer Munt, and I'm serving as the Assistant Secretary for Clean Energy Economic Development in the North Carolina Department of Commerce. I also serve as Governor Roy Cooper's representative on this task force and appreciate the opportunity to share North Carolina's perspectives on this call for information and nominations for possible commercial wind energy leasing in this second round of planning in the Central Atlantic region. My North Carolina colleagues and I are committed to working with BOEM and our federal, state, tribal, and local partners on continued responsible offshore wind development off of our coast. We understand that robust iterative work that's required to deconflict the OCS lands and identify new areas in the Central Atlantic region that are suitable for wind energy project development is of the highest importance. This work will catalyze economic investments and provide for accompanying job creation that will generate economic growth in North Carolina, the region, and the United States as we endeavor to transition to a clean energy economy. Next slide, please. During this short presentation, I'm going to provide some background and overview of our relevant state policies and activities, as well as articulate our goals for the Central Atlantic 2 planning effort. Next slide, please. I'm sure most of you have seen this chart before, but with over 300 miles of coastline, North Carolina boasts expansive OCS areas with relatively shallow water depths to develop offshore wind energy projects. This chart that NREL developed years ago displays the technical potential for offshore wind for the states on the East Coast. And you can see how the area and ocean depths translate into North Carolina's considerable offshore wind energy opportunity. In fact, NREL stated that our geographic location is favorable to serve markets along the Atlantic coast to help meet both immediate and future demands. Next slide, please. In terms of where we are with the industry, North Carolina brings significant assets to offshore wind energy. First, we are a leader in manufacturing, ranked first among the Atlantic coast states in terms of manufacturing GDP, and we ranked 5th nationwide in manufacturing GDP. We have 2 deepwater ports along our coast, and one at Morehead City has no overhead draft restrictions and an easy 4-mile sail to open ocean. We have a skilled and experienced workforce with more than 470 people who are employed in over 10,000 companies, ranking us first in manufacturing in the Southeast. We also have top-ranked educational institutions with 52 4-year colleges and universities, a 58-campus community college system, and we annually award more than 160,000 post-secondary degrees or certificates and more than 29,000 STEM-related degrees. And lastly, we have strong state commitments to clean energy and the transition to a clean energy economy. Next slide, please. I would note that North Carolina's offshore wind commitments and activities under the leadership of Governor Roy Cooper have been clear. In the first quarter of his first term, BOEM auctioned the Kitty Hawk Wind Energy Area, which was awarded to Avangrid Renewables. In the fall of 2020, Governor Cooper signed on to the Smart Power MOU with the governors of Maryland and Virginia. The Smart Power stands for the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic Regional Transformative Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Resources. In 2021, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 218, which established our offshore wind development goals and also created the North Carolina Task Force for Offshore Wind Economic Resource Strategies, or as we like to refer to it as NC Towers, which was tasked with identifying supply chain, workforce development, and upskilling opportunities, as well as the infrastructure and investment assets that are necessary to lift off North Carolina's offshore wind industry. Later in 2021, Governor Cooper signed bipartisan legislation that directs our major electric utility, Duke Energy, to reduce its carbon emissions by 70% by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century. We are working across the administration to get as much offshore wind into our state's energy resource mix as possible. And then the following spring, in 2022, BOEM held the auction for Carolina Long Bay off of our southern coast, during which Duke Energy Renewables and Total Energies were each awarded a leasehold. And then in June 2022, Governor Cooper committed North Carolina's participation in President Biden's federal state offshore wind implementation partnership. Since then, we have signed a memorandum of understanding with colleagues in the Danish Energy Agency to learn from the world's most experienced country in offshore wind, with over 30 years of offshore wind deployment experience. And following the kickoff last year, North Carolina is in the final stages of work with partners at the National Renewable Energy Labs and now RDC to complete an offshore wind supply chain and workforce assessment for the Smart Power region. All of these things and more have led us to this moment with the Central Atlantic too. Please, next slide, please. I would note that we have been working with BOEM since last summer to take this second look at the Central Atlantic region so that we can identify new areas that will enable us to get to our 2040 goal of developing 8 gigawatts of offshore wind off of the North Carolina coast. The areas that are held under lease already, and they're denoted in green and blue respectively, will nearly get us there, but we are going to fall short without new wind energy areas identified. The commitments that have been made over the course of the past year during meetings with Secretary Holland, BOEM Director Klein, and culminating with Secretary Holland's April announcement of the 5-year leasing plan are examples of North Carolina's collaborative federal-state relationship with BOEM and working together towards our shared missions of developing offshore wind responsibly to meet both state and national goals. The consideration of thousands of acres of OCS lands off North Carolina's coast for potential offshore wind energy development in this call will surely help us meet our state's development goal of 8 gigawatts by 2040, and importantly, help contribute to our legislative mandate to decarbonize our electric power sector. Next slide, please. So that all said, our goals for Central Atlantic 2 are as follows. First, we want this to be a transparent and collaborative process where all voices are heard, and we appreciate and thank BOEM for participating with us in this way thus far. Second, we want to work with BOEM and other ocean users, including the military, environmental, wildlife, fisheries, natural and cultural resources, maritime, and understand socioeconomics across all of these activities and use data to drive the decision-making. And all of these data are going to drive decisions towards these particular goals. The first, and essentially, identifying a new wind energy area or multiple areas that are at least 3 gigawatts of capacity to help us meet that 8 gigawatt development goal, and which would amount to approximately 185,000 acres. We would like to see these areas identified no closer than 20 miles from our shores to address and limit potential viewshed concerns. And then lastly, we would like to see as much compatibility as possible with other ocean users in these identified wind energy areas. Last slide, thank you. Again, on behalf of my colleagues here in North Carolina, we truly appreciate and thank BOEM and the team with whom we've been working for the past year to get us to this point with the Central Atlantic 2. And we welcome the ongoing collaboration and coordination with BOEM, the other federal partners, other states and local and tribal stakeholders to get us to some wind energy areas at the end of this process. Thanks, and I will be available at the end of all the states' presentations to take questions.
Thanks, Jennifer. Many thanks. As I mentioned, we're going to just roll through the 5 presentations. And so next up is Virginia, Jennifer Wally. So Jennifer, I'll just click through and we should have you ready to go. Over to you, Jennifer. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for your time today. It's great to be with you all. I want to thank BOEM for the opportunity to be with you as well and work with you all throughout this process. We're going to take a slightly different approach this morning and bring in kind of some of our subject matter experts. As David mentioned, I'm Jennifer Wally. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources here in Virginia. And essentially what that means is in our secretariat, we have a handful of agencies, and about half of those are heavily involved in our offshore wind equities. We also have other secretariats as well that have numerous agencies that you will hear from today. So I'm going to kind of set the table. You will hear from our Department of Energy here in Virginia here shortly, as well as our Department of Environmental Quality as it relates to their CZM components, as well as the Port of Virginia, which is a vital part of our economic development and infrastructure here in Virginia and a great partner. And then last but not least, our Virginia Marine Resources Commission, which handles a lot of our fisheries engagements. With that, in just a moment, I will turn it over to my colleagues in our various agencies. But like I said, wanted to thank you all again today. And what you will hear, I think, from the folks is kind of an echo from the governor. We appreciate kind of an all of the above energy approach and realize that wind energy fits into that. But we are also very mindful of striking a balance here in Virginia of how that plays into our economic development as well as our fisheries management. So like I said, you will hear from a few different folks today, all of our subject matter experts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken in our energy department. So thank you all.
Great. And I want to make sure, Ken, can you just raise your hand quickly so that Charlotte knows how to unmute you?
I think I should be unmuted. Can you
Okay,
hear me?
great. Gotcha. Yep.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ken German. I'm with the Virginia Department of Energy, or just Virginia Energy as we are known. We are asked to put together no more than one slide just talking about energy planning in Virginia. And this is that one slide. Someone else put this together for me. But so briefly, for those of you unfamiliar, we have something called the Virginia Energy Plan, which is a document that's released in the first year of each governor's administration for the past several administrations at least. And the 2022 plan, released under the Youngkin administration, provides an assessment of the current state of Virginia's energy economy, a practical approach for basing energy policy decisions, and recommendations for policymakers going forward. And as Jennifer alluded to, the plan has an all of the above approach to generation, which ensures a flexible path going forward that can respond to the changing and growing electricity demands of energy consumers. And it's based on 5 guiding principles. These include reliability, affordability, innovation, competition, and environmental stewardship. So 2 years after its release, the 2022 plan is going through a midterm review and update to address Virginia's quickly growing energy demand, as shown in this line graph at the top left. And while all sectors are experiencing significant load growth A lot of the load growth shown here is due to the massive growth of data centers in Virginia. And for those who don't know, over 70% of the world's internet traffic passes through Virginia. We've got Google, Facebook, Amazon, and some of the other big players all having large data centers here. And these continue to grow. And the pie chart at the bottom shows our current generation mix, with the vast majority of our generation coming from natural gas and to a lesser extent, nuclear. So if we're going to significantly reduce or eliminate this gas and coal generation, we're going to have to increase the amount of renewables and likely nuclear. Having said all that, we believe that offshore wind can and probably will play a big role in dialing back the percentage of generation that comes from carbon emitting sources. And that is my take on Virginia's energy planning.
Thanks, Ken. Who's next?
That'll be me, Ryan Green, over here at the Coastal Zone Management Program. All right, so thank you all for the time today, and BOEM for making this time for all of us to get together. I want to talk very briefly about Department of Environmental Quality and the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. We are a network program. What that means is we're comprised of a number of state agencies and local governments, many of which you'll hear from today in some capacity. And we're charged with, the coastal planning, policy, and capacity development through federal and state local funding. And if you work in the coastal zone space, it's one of the most complex regulatory environments that you can work in. And so what that means is a lot of collaboration is involved, and a collaboration such as we're seeing today, led by BOEM. We have underpinning our program enforceable policies that cover our coastal, ocean resources, marine fisheries, dunes and beaches, and wildlife. And that all feeds into Virginia DEQ's Office of Environmental Impact Review, which manages our federal consistency at each stage of the offshore wind development process. And they do that through input from the CZM network, including the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, the DOE, the Department of Wildlife Resources, and all of that input goes into those consistency determinations. I want to talk very briefly, and go to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk very briefly about an effort we are currently undertaking, which is to develop a Virginia Ocean Plan. And in this effort, we're working with over 120 stakeholders to develop this plan. And why would we want to do that? Just want to note that, and this is similar for other states on the line here, the ocean's getting busy. We've got the soon-to-be deepest harbor on the East Coast, second largest by volume, largest naval base, and among the largest commercial fishing industries in the country. Much of that is expanding. So what you see in that trend is that complexity is increasing in the ocean management space, particularly off the coast of Virginia. So to manage that complexity, proactive coordination is really the name of the game. It's the best way to make sure that we're promoting and balancing all of our ocean uses and also our critical marine habitat. So I think that is kind of the rationale for why we have undertaken this significant effort to engage in this plan. What we want out of this plan is to communicate what's important, what should folks know, and not just the industry stakeholders, not just the state agencies, but the public. What do they need to know about the way the ocean is managed? And then crucially, and I think this is what's most relevant today, is provide a mechanism for ongoing coordination across our stakeholder groups, which are many, about ocean management issues, and not just offshore wind, the issue that brings us together today. And then to the extent we can, we hope to make some recommendations about data gaps, process improvements, and those kind of things. I want to say that, with the timeline of this planning effort, which we intend to have a rough draft towards the end of 2025, obviously will not be able to directly impact this process, but we consider it in context. But in the spirit of that planning effort, what I would encourage BOEM to do, and I'd say continue doing, since we are making this effort today to all be together, led by BOEM, is to go ahead and make sure that we are considering all the input received from our stakeholders in Virginia, our state agencies, our local governments, our industry associations to date, including in Central Atlantic 1, and then make sure that we're incorporating all the relevant data that we have into the wind energy area siting process. And again, I thank BOEM for organizing this today, and I will pass it off to my colleague Andrew Sinclair at the Port of Virginia.
Thanks, Ryan. So again, Andrew Sinclair, I'm the Director of Federal Government Affairs at the Port of Virginia. We are the statewide port authority. My other Virginia colleagues have or will discuss other interests, so my comments will focus on Virginia's interest in commercial shipping and maritime trade. But I do also want to frame my comments by noting that we at the port have dedicated one of our facilities as what I would say is the premier offshore wind staging hub on the East Coast. And we are fully supportive of the offshore wind industry as long as it does not detrimentally impact commercial shipping and other existing interests. And that's a goal that we do believe is fully attainable. As has been previously mentioned, the Mid-Atlantic is a busy area of the ocean with multiple interests. This image on your screen is just a capture of some of those layers from the Marco data portal to help illustrate that. But importantly, as existing lease areas are built out, these uses will become more condensed as the current traffic diverts around the new offshore wind areas. This makes preserving open ocean that much more important to balance the needs of commercial shipping with that of offshore wind, as well as commercial fishing, U.S. Navy operations, commercial space launches, and others. Specifically, as BOEM moves forward, we urge you to consider, as you have in the past, the pending U.S. Coast Guard fairways as identified in the Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study, historically utilized anchorage areas, U.S. Navy operating areas, subsea cable routes, and those other uses to be considered and excluded as the call area moves forward. So in that context, and acknowledging that this call area includes additional areas, specifically to the north and the south of call area 1, we urge BOEM to recognize the significant planning and coordination that has already taken place off of the Mid-Atlantic, and where there is overlap between the two call areas, to respect that work and specifically take the final 2023 wind energy areas as the starting point for this effort for call area 2, and not move forward any previously excluded areas for further consideration. So with that, I will pass it to my colleague Todd at VMRC.
Great. Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew. You're going to hear, as Jennifer Wally had indicated, a pretty common theme here across the board that Virginia's taken an approach which is looking to balance the equities of all ocean users. And it's truly, becoming, as we're hearing, a more complex landscape that's there. The biggest one, obviously, in our interest is how we're balancing the changes in ocean use from renewable energy to commercial fishing. And we appreciate the opportunity to continue to express high concern of how we are adequately and authentically integrating those equities. Virginia is very proud of its fishing industry. We are very proud to be one of the top 4 ports in the country. And I'm going to go through a series of slides that are going to demonstrate sort of our geographic footprint of activity. We have submitted comments as far back in the first call area as early as 22. We were frustrated that some of those areas continue to go unaddressed. And we recognize that changes in the ocean are going to unfairly impact Virginia because of our operational footprint compared to our neighboring states. As I said, we're proud of our size. We're proud of our geographic range. We have fishing happening as far north as Massachusetts. We rely on companies and fishing industries to land products out of our northern states in Virginia that make up our diverse portfolio. And the NEPA process so far should be a process where avoidance and minimization is the stress and a lower reliance on compensation for its mitigation. And so far, it has pretty much been a process of a minimal amount of avoidance and minimization and an even smaller amount of compensatory mitigation. With the recent White House press release, there was a goal stating protecting biodiversity and marine ecosystems, yet it characterized an objective of the coordinated effort to support supply chains and continue to seize on opportunities to advance the technology, blatantly ignoring and acknowledging the balance necessary to protect the American seafood industry as we advance our offshore energy goals. And I'm going to kind of go through here in the next series of slides relatively quickly, recognizing we've got a short amount of time.
And if you can click, these are all images publicly available from the Marco or the NROC data portals. Looking at the heat maps of scallop operations off of Delaware Bay in the rotational areas, this is just sort of the activities between 2015 and 2019. You see the activities out of Virginia into Virginia from those areas. Next slide. The National Marine Fisheries Service fishing footprint, recognizing dredge scallop landings out of that same location. What I'm going to demonstrate next is going to be our next slide is the communities at sea. While these data are a bit dated, they still recognize the same locations. The red outline shows what is relevant to Virginia in the time period right there from 2011 to 15. We look forward to seeing the 16 to 20 data range to communicate further the importance of those areas off of Delaware Bay for some of our most valuable fisheries. Next slide. As we look at purse seine landings, this is overall concentration, as you can see at the mouth of Delaware Bay between 11 and 15. Next slide, you can look at the NROC portal demonstrating the menhaden biomass concentrations off of Delaware Bay, off of Virginia and North Carolina. Menhaden is one of our highest value fisheries within our ocean portfolio. Next slide. We get into a bottom trawl, similar approach using the Marco portal. You can see the black outlines identifying those areas relative to Virginia, overlapping on the heat maps of all port activities to show the importance to Virginia. Next slide gets into the squid, mackerel, butterfish, FMP, looking at, again, the importance of Virginia and activities overlapping with the existing polygon for the Central Atlantic for 15 to 19. And then as we, next slide, get into pots and traps. This is sort of overall activity relative for pots and traps. As far as density, you do see a lot of concentration in Virginia. Our eastern shore, our two poorest counties in the state have a high reliance on the fishing economy to support them. And the ports that are highlighted in there include Waterprig, Chincoteague, Cape Charles, that land a lot of our products in pot and trap, as well as Virginia Beach. Next slide, we get into gillnet. Once again, the concentration of activities and potential conflicts in those areas continue to expand out of these small areas. You know, the reliance on those are important to maintain the traditional values and the families that rely on that income. And then the next slide looks at overall surf clam. This is a challenge. Surf clam, Virginia has a reemergent surf clam industry that reemerged around 2021. I'll show some images. This slide only goes up to 2020, so it doesn't reflect the activities here. If you go to the next slide, these were shared by the industry with permission to share publicly the activities off of Virginia that we look at the resources that are existing right now, including in the two wind lease areas, one that's actively being developed and one that was just completed in its lease. And then the second slide shows similar activity between 3 boats and 1 boat. And so we appreciate the opportunity to ensure that Virginia's diverse fishing economy is included as we move forward here, and that we take a more balanced approach of how we address this in an equitable manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks everyone from Virginia. It's judging by the next slide, it looks like that's the end of Virginia's presentation. So I want to thank all of you who stepped up. Maryland is up, and I think Ryan is up first, Ryan Opsal. So or just let me know. But Ryan, if it's you, I'll make sure that Charlotte can open up your mic. You'll have to go ahead and unmute yourself as well.
There we go. I think I'm working now.
Excellent. Yeah, you're good.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm Ryan Opsal. I'm the Director of Policy at the Maryland Energy Administration. Go to the next slide.
Oops.
So just really quick snapshot looking at offshore wind in Maryland right now. I mean, the furthest project that we have right now is US Wind. It was previously awarded to offtake agreements from the Maryland Public Service Commission and is now actually going through a legislatively supported rebid process. in order to basically get additional funding. Since I think as we experienced, especially last year, a lot of our original offtakes were uneconomic. They've also received a record of decision for their environmental impact assessment. The other lease areas pertaining to Maryland, Ørsted, they canceled their OREC awards earlier in the year, but they do still retain the lease space. And as was previously mentioned in the BOEM presentation, Equinor did recently provisionally win their lease space in the most recent Central Atlantic auction for Area A2. Generally, the state participates in a number of research initiatives. We're trying to lower capital costs of offshore wind projects, develop a more robust supply chain, and really beef up the workforce in the state and the greater region. And that's in addition to working on grid and transmission related issues. We're currently in the middle of a regional study in partnership with NREL, North Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware, in order to understand a lot of the regional strengths and challenges related to developing our supply chain and workforce. Since 2013, the state has invested roughly $45 million into the offshore wind supply chain and workforce initiatives. Much of this came from a federal grant and is run through our Department of Labor. Other came through various tranches from the offshore wind developers through their original offtake agreements. Next slide. The U.S. wind project itself, we're pretty excited about. As I mentioned, it's the furthest along. They recently received the record decision on September 5th. BOEM approved this under the preferred alternative scenario. So roughly 114 turbines, 14 to 18 megawatts in size, 4 offshore substations, a Met tower, and transmission making landfall at 3R Beach. As I also mentioned, the previous offtake agreements were deemed basically uneconomic, which is also why Ørsted had to cancel their OREC awards. US Wind is going through this process right now. And now as it's going through this rebid process at our Public Service Commission, we know that actually they're looking to fill out the entire area with not 2.2 gigawatts, but actually 1.7 gigawatts, which is in their public filing. In general, they're going to build out this field from east to west, beginning outermost and moving inward. And just really quick to Ørsted still does hold the other lease, but they are expected to reapply for offtake at some point. We have more than one procurement mechanism available in the state. If you go to the next slide. Just very briefly, in the state, we really sort of started with offshore wind in 2013 with our first legislation, establishing a carve out in our renewable portfolio standard. This was expanded in 2019 with additional minimum procurement amounts. We also have the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, which called for a 60% reduction in carbon emissions by 2031 from 2006 levels. And probably the largest development for offshore wind in the state was last year, the Power Act of 2023, which expanded Maryland's offshore wind goal to 8.5 gigawatts by 2031. Our agency is also acting on an executive order from the governor to work on a framework for 100% clean generation by 2035. Let me just expand on a couple of things there. One, the Power Act has two other very important components to it. One is the additional procurement mechanism that I just mentioned in relation to Ørsted. We're hoping that they're eventually able to access that. We're expecting an RFP from our Department of General Services sometime before the end of the year. This is a flexible procurement mechanism that is available to other companies as well. Also under the Power Act, we are working with our Public Service Commission and PJM to develop a transmission study by December of 2025, specifically for reaching our goals and what that transmission configuration will look like. Also under recent legislation from earlier this year, which enabled the rebid process for US wind, the Maryland Public Service Commission, in conjunction with MEA, also is working on a schedule to achieve 8.5 gigawatts by 2031. We're also doing several other things in the state. We're working a lot on regional collaboration, whether it's transmission or it's Smart Power Initiative, as our colleagues in North Carolina mentioned earlier. MEA, our agency, has several OSW-related programs, along with the Department of Labor, trying to work on workforce development as much as possible. We're also partnering with NREL in the supply chain and workforce study to better understand opportunities and best way to develop in the Mid-Atlantic region. And we also are working on a NOWRDC partnership, researching offshore wind technology and resiliency as well. And go to slide 5. Just very briefly before I hand it off to our DNR colleagues, which, if you haven't given her the ability to unmute yet, that would be Catherine McCall at Maryland DNR. One thing is, I think we're a big fan of bidders credits. This has turned out really well. We do know that we want to obviously defray from the costs, especially to our ratepayers, as much as possible. This is obviously a mechanism for doing that. And second, for stakeholder engagement, I think we are, happy with the way that this is developing. We're looking forward to engaging more with BOEM and any of the other key stakeholders that are out there. And certainly this time around in the second Central Atlantic process, we're very eager to better understand the concerns of key stakeholders and throughout the area that may have concerns, and any mitigation measures that can be taken to free up any additional space for the state, because we are short on our goals with the actual space that we have available to us right now. With that, thank you BOEM for setting this up, and I will pass it off to Catherine.
Thanks, Ryan. My name is Catherine McCall. I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources as our Director for Coastal and Ocean Management. So I wanted to provide a few comments on behalf of the state's resource management agency that's responsible for balancing sustainable uses of our coast with some of the natural resource needs. Maryland DNR really appreciates the opportunity to continue to provide feedback on the continued Central Atlantic offshore wind leasing discussion. As more leasing is considered, we really want to provide some reflections about the call area and the Central Atlantic 1 process, and some of the things that we highlighted in the first round remain applicable for the proposed call area that we're discussing today. We really continue to focus on the region that generally extends from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in the Virginia area to the northern extent of Central Atlantic 2. This portion of the call area contains some really unique seafloor communities, provides migratory pathways for marine mammals, such as the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, and it supports a variety of economic industries, such as commercial fishing, shipping, other ones that a few of the other states have mentioned. The offshore environment in this area also really holds important potential for future locations for geologic carbon storage. So a lot of different things to consider as the call areas are winnowed down. The natural resources and uses are really important to the economic and cultural vitality of our region. And one thing that we continue to point out when we discuss the area off the mouth of the Delaware Bay and Delmarva Peninsula is a unique consideration for the Carl Schuster Horseshoe Crab Reserve. Horseshoe crabs are used in the bait industry and also a significant portion of our biomedical industry around the country. Several lease areas already overlap with that portion of the northern call area, so it may suggest just a closer look at what potential leasing may arise in that area. Wanted to provide a few comments first regarding considerations for leasing and bidding. We really do encourage BOEM to again prioritize that avoid, minimize, mitigate approach where it concerns fishing. The state supports approaches that continue to reflect existing uses such as fishing in the selection of leasing and including fisheries compensation in the bidding and lease process. From that engagement perspective, as the call area is further refined, we really encourage all of the task force members and BOEM to continue to work with and regularly engage the fishing industry, the shipping industry, and all the other partners and find meaningful ways for their feedback to be considered in the process and integrated into the siting through subsequent NEPA processes. I think it will be really important to have an increasing focus on quantifying and addressing cumulative impacts. So in summary, just to close out some of DNR's comments is there's a lot of significant investments that have been made in the Central Atlantic region to advance offshore wind, invest in data collection and environmental studies, collaborate on environmental work across the Atlantic, and institutionalize best practices and monitoring protocols, and then also create consistent fisheries compensation processes such as the one that the 11 states are working on. Maryland really looks forward to continuing work with BOEM, the task force, and other state partners to continue to guide these refinements. Thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Catherine and Ryan. Next up is Delaware and Lisa Bourne-Ogden.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Lisa Bourne-Ogden, and I'm the Deputy Secretary at the Delaware's Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. And on behalf of all of our colleagues at DENREC, thank you for the opportunity to share an update on Delaware's offshore wind development initiatives and to learn more about progress other Atlantic states are making in their efforts. Next slide. This morning, I will share details on Delaware's recently passed Energy Solutions Act as it applies to offshore wind, touch upon the importance of communication and collaboration, and I will revisit environmental considerations we identified in 2021 prior to the first Atlantic call that remain applicable today. Next slide. In their session that concluded on June 30th, Delaware lawmakers passed and the governor recently signed the Energy Solutions Act. This bill lays out a detailed framework for the state's solicitation, consideration, and potential approval of a future offshore wind project. The Energy Solutions Act authorizes the State Energy Office to procure up to 1,200 megawatts of electricity to Delaware's public utilities. It also authorizes the State Energy Office, in consultation with Delaware Public Service Commission and the Delaware Renewable Energy Task Force, to craft a solicitation for offshore wind. The solicitations must have a term of at least 20 years, meet benchmark pricing guidelines, and describe the potential impacts to the electrical transmission system and energy markets in Delaware. They also must specify a number of detailed economic costs and benefits for the state, including potential jobs created, supply chain requirements, and workforce development needs. Finally, Delaware can initiate its own project or partner with another state. The Energy Solutions Act is a major step forward in our efforts to reduce reliance on GHG emissions and will enhance our efforts to achieve GHG reduction targets mandated in the Delaware Climate Solutions Act. Next slide. As more lease areas become available, working together collaboratively is critically important, both when identifying potential procurement projects, as well as identifying transmission connection locations and shared transmission lines in the region. This can provide consistency and improve navigation of the regulatory processes. Delaware strongly supports the U.S. Department of Energy's position, as laid out in the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Action Plan, that over the mid to long term, increased interregional coordination, shared transmission lines, and an offshore network of HVDC interlinks can more efficiently bring this energy onshore. And as previously noted, Delaware's newly passed Energy Solutions Act identifies and authorizes partnerships and collaborations as a goal when considering offshore wind projects. Next slide. Lastly, while the state is supportive of renewable energy, it needs to be done and planned for in a way that recognizes environmental impacts and minimizes conflicting uses of this space. As BOEM considers additional lease areas, Delaware stands by the environmental considerations laid out in our November 2021 response to BOEM's request for preliminary state review of the draft Central Atlantic Renewable Energy Planning Area. In that response, we noted that although Delaware is a small state, its coastal and marine resources yield a healthy and robust environment, substantially contributing to the economy and livelihood of its residents. Activities with the potential to impact these uses and resources should be carefully considered to ensure resource sustainability while advancing Delaware's commitment to support and encourage responsible renewable energy development on the outer continental shelf. Our review included potential impacts and areas of consideration, including commercial and recreational fishing, fisheries, marine mammals, coastal birds, habitat, cultural and historical resources, and other areas that should be considered prior to approval of new wind energy areas or potential lease sales. We have also listened to the voices in our community who've expressed concerns. Among them, the impact of turbine visibility from beaches that some worry will impact tourism or property values, adequacy of emergency services and their ability to respond to any offshore wind-related emergency, and the impact on wildlife and the environment. Next slide. Thank you again for the opportunity to share our update, and to those other member states for their continuing coordination and collaboration on offshore wind development in the Mid-Atlantic.
Thank you, Lisa. Thanks for the presentation. Okay, one more state to go. And Kevin Dillon, I just saw you come on your camera. So let me go ahead to the next slide. And I think you're taking us, you're kicking off the New Jersey presentation.
Indeed. Good morning. My name is Kevin Dillon. I'm a project manager with the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. Today, I'll provide an overview of the BPU's role in offshore wind in New Jersey, along with the initiatives our agency has undertaken to facilitate achieving the state's goal of 11,000 megawatts of offshore wind generation by 2040. Joining me today will be Colleen Bruss from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, who will give an overview of New Jersey's marine resources off our coast. Next slide, please. While New Jersey's capacity target is the overarching goal, the BPU conducts all of its OREC solicitations with the goal of minimizing the impact on the environment and fisheries, and localizing a robust supply chain in the state to support the development of its solicitation award winners, as well as other projects along the East Coast. New Jersey has undertaken a first-in-the-nation effort to develop coordination transmission solutions for bringing offshore wind energy ashore. This effort seeks to reduce impacts of onshore construction on communities and the environment, and to drive down costs to ratepayers. In keeping with the BPU's mission, minimizing costs and risks to ratepayers is always one of our top priorities. Next slide, please. Before diving into the work our agency is doing, first, I'd like to highlight the key legislation and executive orders that shaped the development of offshore wind in New Jersey. In 2010, New Jersey passed the Offshore Wind Economic Development Act, or OWEDA, which established offshore wind as a Class 1 renewable energy source and directed the BPU to establish a program for ORECs to incentivize development of offshore wind off New Jersey's coastline. ORECs are paid on a per megawatt hour basis for energy delivered to the grid by developers who have won an award through one of our BPU generation solicitations. In 2012, the BPU adopted NJAC 14:8-6, establishing rules that govern the offshore wind solicitation process, such as application requirements and the funding mechanism for the OREC. Finally, there have been a series of executive orders that have progressively increased New Jersey's procurement goals. Most recent Executive Order 307 was signed by Governor Murphy in September of 2022, raising New Jersey's goal to the 11,000 megawatts of generation capacity by 2040. Next slide, please. Achieving New Jersey's goals requires significant planning and coordination. To facilitate timely achievement of our goals, the BPU has published a schedule of all offshore wind solicitations, which was updated in May of this year to expedite our future solicitations. As the table indicates, the board has awarded a total of 5,252 megawatts of capacity associated with projects that are under active development. Our fourth solicitation is currently underway. Next slide, please. Along with our published schedule, the BPU published the state's first offshore wind strategic plan in September of 2020. This plan served as a roadmap for how New Jersey could most productively pursue the goal of 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2035, as set forth in Executive Order 92. Currently, the second offshore wind strategic planning process is underway. When completed, this strategic plan will serve as the roadmap for how we can achieve the current 11,000 megawatt goal. The second offshore wind strategic plan focuses on several key areas, including supply chain, infrastructure and workforce development, energy markets and transmission, and environment and fisheries protection. A draft of this plan will be made available for public comment in the first half of 2025. Next slide. In 2020, the BPU asked PJM to incorporate New Jersey's offshore wind goals into the regional transmission planning process, becoming the first state to use a novel regulatory pathway known as the State Agreement Approach, or SAA. BPU has used the SAA to pursue a coordinated transmission solution to lower costs to New Jersey ratepayers and minimize environmental and community impacts. In 2022, the BPU approved the Larrabee Tri-Collector Solution, or LCS, which creates a new substation and upgrades the existing grid to enable multiple offshore wind projects to interconnect to a single point. Next slide, please. The BPU has opened a solicitation for the pre-build infrastructure, or PBI, which consolidates onshore cable routes for multiple offshore wind projects to minimize disruptions in communities and, again, reduces impacts on the environment. The project awarded through the PBI solicitation will construct unenergized infrastructure to carry power lines from the shore to the LCS. The PBI solicitation process enhances competition to drive down costs by allowing for a broader pool of bidders. And the BPU opened this solicitation in November of 2023, and our board expects to make a decision in Q4 of this year. Next slide, please. We are currently in the evaluation phase of our fourth offshore wind solicitation, which aims to award between 1,200 and 4,000 megawatts of capacity. The solicitation aligns with New Jersey's clean energy and offshore wind goals of combating climate change, promoting economic development and job creation, reducing environmental and fisheries impacts, and achieving these goals at the lowest reasonable cost and lowest risk to ratepayers. The board will make a decision regarding an award in Q4 of this year. Next slide, and I will now pass the mic to my colleague, Colleen.
Thank you, Kevin. Good morning. I'm Colleen Brust from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I work in the Marine Resources Administration. We are tasked with protecting, conserving, and enhancing marine fish and shellfish resources and our fisheries. Our fishing communities and seafood industries are important parts of New Jersey's identity and crucial components of our state's economy. In fact, NOAA's latest Fisheries Economics of the U.S. reported that in the Mid-Atlantic area, the state of New Jersey had the highest values for employment, sales, value added, and income for fisheries. Next slide, please. It was really great to see that the Central Atlantic 2 planning process is starting with information that was provided in the Central Atlantic 1 leasing process, which we actively participated in. We fully support spatial planning for the Central Atlantic and have been glad to see that develop over the last few years. We'd love to collaborate with NOAA and COST to provide fisheries insight on our marine resources, each of which is unique in terms of vulnerability to risk from offshore wind. As a couple of examples, our prime fishing areas that are shown here as blue polygons support recreational and commercial fishing, and they're also difficult to entirely avoid in sighting because we have a lot of them. But we consider our artificial reefs, which are, I hope you can see those, they have kind of their like bright green rectangles. We consider those no-go areas for turbines and cables because the uses are incompatible. Not shown on the map are economically vulnerable waterfront communities that rely on fishery landings like surf clam and scallop. These are New Jersey's highest value fisheries and the fisheries that are most at risk of significant impacts from offshore wind development. The surf clam industry has consistently expressed that they want to continue fishing. If impacts can't be avoided during sighting, then we need to work on how to minimize impacts through efforts like fishery enhancement. Next slide, please. This is one of many images that are available that show fishing effort. This happens to be scallop from 2015 to 2019 through vehicle trip report records. I just wanted to point out that because of confidentiality rules and the rule of 3, there can be very lucrative fishing efforts that are going on that do not show up on any of the heat maps. Next slide, please. Another example of resource-specific impact vulnerabilities is the Mid-Atlantic scallop rotational area, which is, it looks kind of like a mid-green big golf club here in this map. This entire area is essentially closed to transit by scallop vessels unless they've declared that that's their fishing destination. So this is a real limit on how vessels transit from their ports to fishing grounds. And lost time through transit means lost days at sea and lost catch and lost income. So as a reminder, a setback was created for this area in the New York Bight leasing. And if you look at the kind of the northwest edge of that rotational area, you can see that setback between the leases and the management area. Next slide, please. So the good news is that as part of New Jersey's strategic plan update, a desktop study of cable constraints is currently being conducted, and these and many other layers have been assembled, and we can make sure that those layers are available to the NCOS team. Next slide, thank you. So we've been through this a few times before, and some of the lessons that we've learned are that transparency in the winnowing process is really critical to stakeholders like everyone gathered here today to be able to provide the most useful information. And we'd like to see all available information used in spatial planning, not just those data that already have a GIS layer prepared. It's important to continue to inform stakeholders about which type of comments are most effective at which stage of winnowing. And if possible, that should include when in the process moving infrastructure is still on the table. It will be important to meet directly with surf clam and scallop industries to go over the call area and ensure that planners have the most recent data about fishing effort. And to ensure a productive dialogue, we all need to be proactive about addressing misinformation. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to turn it back to Kevin from the BPU.
Thank you. Just to take us home here, and to echo Colleen's point, we do understand the need for a robust public engagement process in all of our initiatives. There is also a need for due diligence and advanced planning for projects looking to identify interconnection points within the state, especially with regards to suitable landfall points and congestion of offshore transmission routes. Next slide, please. The BPU and New Jersey DEP would like to thank BOEM for the opportunity to present today. If there are any questions, please contact the BPU using the email address on your screen or the DEP using the QR code. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin, Colleen. Sorry about the slides. It has some automatic advances in there that tripped me up a little bit. All right, so I want to thank all 5 states for sharing that. That was an enormous amount of information, and we definitely need a break. When we get back from the break, we'll have an opportunity to ask states questions, make some comments. And so why don't we go ahead and take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11:10. And why don't we give it a few more minutes? Actually, no, honestly, it's been so long. Why don't we do it to 11:15 and we'll be fine. We'll make up the time elsewhere. So let's come back at 11:15. And we'll do questions and comments then. I'll throw a slide up that just reminds us that that's what we're doing. And thanks everyone. Take a break. And we'll see you back here in about 14 minutes, 14 minutes. Thanks everyone. And Charlotte. Great. So welcome back from a break. That was a significant amount of presentation. And I hope those of you in the task force were taking some notes, maybe some questions that you have, and or some comments. As I mentioned earlier when Seth Tierkoff was presenting, our way of doing this is we're going to, if you have some questions for the states, go ahead and drop those right in the chat right now. That would be really helpful. Just task force members, drop some stuff in the chat. If you're just joining us, or if you joined us a little late, if you're observing our meeting today of the task force, again, this task force is of public officials. We're going to be doing a public input session for public observers tomorrow. We're not doing it today, but we're very happy to have everybody with us today observing. But tomorrow, around this time, we'll be doing public input. And if you think you're stranded in the public and you're a member of the task force, please email Charlotte. All right, so we're trying to pin some of you all up here. We may be having some challenges with that, but I'm not seeing questions in the chat. So task force members, if you do have some questions, please go ahead and drop those in the chat. That would be helpful to do. Otherwise, do as the Senator did and raise your hand if you're going to have some comments, and we'll go to those hands in just a second. I'm just seeing if there's any other questions happening in the chat. Okay, so why don't we go to hands, and first up, Senator Carosa, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank BOEM again, and I wanted to thank our Maryland state representatives from the departments for presenting. As the only state senator representing Ocean City and Maryland's only Ocean Beach town in all of Worcester County, I have been raising questions and concerns since 2017 about the first process. And as a result of those questions and concerns not being addressed, have been steadfast in my opposition to the offshore wind energy industrialization of the Atlantic Ocean off Maryland's coast, again, going back to 2017. And this represents numerous and multiple constituent concerns over the years. And despite the numerous unanswered questions and unresolved issues with the first round of leases in the Atlantic Ocean off Maryland's coast, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has started this new process, a call for information and nomination, a second regional offshore wind energy sale in the Atlantic Ocean. So getting back to call area 2, I went back in preparation and to read the notice, and it said that BOEM will consider the Central Atlantic Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force to further evaluate the appropriateness of the call area for offshore wind energy development for call area 2. And that notice goes on to state that the call area is broad to allow for flexibility to minimize conflicts with other uses such as commercial fishing, military activities, and vessel traffic. It doesn't mention marine life in this part of the notice. Yet the very issues that Call Area 2 notice states that BOEM will allow flexibility to minimize conflicts have not even remotely been resolved for the first Central Atlantic Ocean call area. And from that standpoint, it only makes sense that BOEM would pause and postpone consideration of the second Central Atlantic call area until the multiple pending issues related to the first Central Atlantic call area have been resolved. And I just briefly want to go over those unresolved questions and issues that so many of my constituents and people across Maryland have raised. One is the multiple deaths and damaging reproductive impacts on marine animals, with very legitimate environmental questions linking the death of marine life to new offshore wind energy projects. Denial of those events flies in the face of the approved takings of those species, which serves as an advert admission of a certain degree of expected deaths, especially of whales. It was brought up before, but I want to underscore horseshoe crab protection, we believe, is being ignored as well. Despite the existence of designated sanctuary for this species, whose blood is so critical for the medical use, plans to use this area are still being pursued. And the negative impact of drilling and of transmission lines carrying electric current adjacent to horseshoe breeding grounds is expected. Testimony by the military that offshore wind projects interfere with radar, search and rescue operations, military training exercises, we believe are still being ignored, creating a homeland security threat. The detrimental impact on Ocean City will drain the tax revenues to Worcester County and the state of Maryland. Damaging impacts on commercial fishing, and this was brought up by the other states as well. We've had a thriving commercial fishing industry since 1933 when the storm created the inlet. But we believe we've talked about on this call the proposed mitigation and compensation plans, but they are not being well received by our commercial fishing industry. Our local fishermen, they want to work. And I wanted to also raise the issue again that the broken wind turbine blade failure, closing several beaches on Nantucket in July, with the cleanup requiring the use of hazmat suits, has raised serious safety issues. Again, those issues not being resolved earlier, now we're going forward with a call area 2. And I also want to raise the questions about hurricanes and the impact that it could have on our local area. No one, as far as I know, has adequately researched the potential impact of a hurricane in Ocean City and the potential damage to wind turbines less than 11 miles off of Ocean City, how that would impact. And the image of a football-length projectile wind turbine blade spiraling towards Ocean City's populated beach, especially in the peak summer months, is frightening. And so while some of the expressed concerns are addressed in the environmental impact studies, BOEM's conclusion has been to accept them as only possible and therefore not having a significant bearing. And although the community and its elected officials strongly object to the wind energy projects off Maryland's coast, the push to proceed with them without adequately addressing longstanding and unaddressed concerns steadily moves forward. So now we're faced with the development of additional lease areas with this proposed Central Atlantic Ocean call area 2. And so just to summarize, I'm the only Maryland state senator representing Maryland's only beach town. and representing constituents and Marylanders across the state who have these concerns about the industrialization of the Atlantic Ocean off Maryland's coast. And so it seems only reasonable to request that BOEM pause and postpone action on moving forward with the second Central Atlantic Ocean lease area until all these multiple questions and concerns have been addressed from the first calling area. So the local input is very important, and I appreciate BOEM taking that seriously. We will continue to use these opportunities to raise both past questions and why we believe those issues need to be resolved before you would ever go forward with a second lease area. Thank you for this time.
Thank you, Senator, for those comments. And I don't know whether some of the colleagues from the states have some reactions to those comments that they'd like to offer. You're welcome to.
Yeah, this is Ryan Opsel again, Policy Director for Maryland Energy Administration. Look, we of course welcome the comments from the senator, and we look forward to continuing to work with the senator and Ocean City on any outstanding issues. Beyond that, I'm very happy to work with the senator also offline to go over these individual points. There was a lot that were brought up. I think many, most or all have been addressed in our point of view. But like I said, there was a lot brought up there. But I'd be happy to go over those maybe one-on-one with the senator.
And I appreciate that. And I guess in closing, because I know others have questions, we have our representatives from the various state departments and agencies on this virtual meeting today. And while I think it's important that at a leadership level in the state of Maryland, that there's a recognition that while you may believe that those issues have been fully addressed, that thousands of my constituents and Marylanders across the state do not believe those issues have been addressed. And, just that one example about the impact on the commercial fishing industry in Maryland, you should recognize that, instead of, a strategy of avoidance, it seems like it's only a strategy of mitigation and compensation packages where, that's not going over well with our commercial fishing industry, our locals. They want to work. The other issues that have been raised have not been fully addressed. And that's why I went through, a list of those. So, I do plan with my colleagues, with the leadership of Ocean City and Worcester County, and the other local government officials working with the state to continue to bring those up, because if they weren't resolved in the call area process, it makes no sense to move forward with a call area 2 process.
Thanks, Senator. I want to break it out to other members of the task force. If folks have questions of any nature for any of the 5 states, remember that presentation from North Carolina a while ago, Virginia, everybody else. If there's questions that you had as the states were presenting, this is a great time to ask those questions. You can do that in the chat. Seth has a question for New Jersey. You can see that in the chat. Would like to learn more about New Jersey's transmission desktop study. What types of information is going into that process? I wonder if one of our New Jersey colleagues could just speak to that, to what's going on in that process for the desktop transmission study in New Jersey.
Yeah, I can respond to that briefly, Seth. So our strategic plan update had a number of environmental studies built in, and one was this cable constraint study, and it was modeled in part after what New York did in their state waters. Our study is extended all the way out to the shelf break. And the idea is really to put together all of the GIS layers that are available that represent some kind of constraint to cable siting, whether it's a natural resource or anthropogenic. And Seth, I would be very happy to send you a little more information about that. It's a team from Rutgers that is doing that work for us along with Ramble.
Thanks, Colleen. Okay. Any other questions or comments? Would folks like to raise hand from the task force for state colleagues about the presentations or things? And presenters, feel free to have questions of each other as well, if you have some. I see a question in the chat about, I'd love to see more information on the cable constraints desktop study as well. Thank you, Colleen. So yeah, Colleen, if there's a way to provide some information for that or any links that you have, be great.
We don't have deliverables yet. We're expecting them sometimes next summer after there's an initial period of review, both internally here in the state and with our stakeholders. But I'll make a note of who's asking for more information and keep you updated.
Wonderful. Okay. Thanks. All right, just another round. If anybody wants to drop a question in the chat from the task force members. And again, members of the public who are joining us today, we're glad you're here. We're going to do comments and public input opportunity tomorrow at 11:20-ish. So we look forward to seeing you all there for those who want to do it. So we're not going to take questions or do public input today from folks who aren't task force members. All right, anything else for our state colleagues? Okay. Well, I want to thank our state colleagues again. I'll just note there is another sort of comment, questiony thing in the chat if folks want to see it. And Nicole, I welcome if you want to raise your hand and say a little bit more about that. But again, I'll just read it aloud, saying I do think the scope of review for the call areas should adequately address public interest factors that are impacted near and onshore as a result of the cable landfalls. Okay. Great. All right, with that, we are going to switch gears into our next piece, which is some presentations from federal partners. And thanks again, state folks that prepared presentations and offered them. I really appreciate that. First up is going to be NOAA, NOAA Fisheries. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. I see Sue Tuxbury's up. Good to see you, Sue. Thanks for joining. And let me just get the presentation going.
Great. Thank you, David. Yeah, thank you. And thanks for allowing us the opportunity to present today. My name is Sue Tuxbury. I'm the Wind Program Coordinator for the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office. And I just want to recognize that this presentation and the information that we are providing to BOEM as part of this process is really a team effort. Next slide, please. And our team is comprised of 2 regions as part of NOAA Fisheries in the Greater Atlantic region, as well as the Southeast region. And the call area for the Central Atlantic overlaps with both regions. We are regularly coordinating on wind activities across this area and across our regions. And collectively, we are coordinating with BOEM and NCOS to help inform the site identification process. The focus of this presentation will largely be on our role in the process, mostly our resources under jurisdiction expertise that are found in the Central Atlantic call areas, as well as challenges, recommendations, and lessons learned. Next slide, please. Given our mission as the agency responsible for the stewardship of our nation's ocean resources and their habitat, We have an important role to play at each stage of the offshore wind permitting process. We have both a regulatory role as well as providing scientific support. During this first site identification phase for the call areas, we are largely providing technical assistance, comments, scientific information, and support to help inform BOEM's process. Next slide, please. So the protection of marine habitats is a critical component of NMFS's mission and goals for productive and sustainable fisheries and the conservation and recovery of protected marine species. There are several sensitive habitats in the call areas and deep water areas. Hard bottom habitats ranging from cobble boulders, exposed limestone ledges with relief, and canyons along the shelf break are included in this area. These are habitats vulnerable to impacts from development. Deep sea corals are found on these hard habitats. They're fragile and slow growing, making them especially vulnerable to permanent loss and impacts that cannot be mitigated. The deep water areas also overlap with coral protection area, which is of concern. Additionally, the shelf break and canyons, this area includes both important pelagic or water column and benthic or bottom habitats. And they're often delineated by oceanographic fronts. So even though the break is not included in this area, we are concerned about the effects of future development and operational effects on this area and transmission through the shelf break. And there is risk of overlapping with areas of upwelling that extend beyond the break itself. There's also habitat areas of particular concerns. These are subsets of essential fish habitat that are identified as priorities for conservation, management, and research. Several were called HAPSES are overlap with this area, including hard bottom coral, snapper grouper, dolphin wahoo, coastal migratory pelagics, tilefish, canyons, and sandbar sharks. The point, it's called right offshore of Cape Hatteras, an area of North Carolina, is an area where currents converge and resulting in upwelling and areas of high productivity and biodiversity. The Gulf Stream is a thermal refuge for many species, both commercial fish species and protected species. And while these areas avoid the mean north wall of the Gulf Stream is variable and risks overlapping with some of these draft areas. There are sand ridge and trough complexes and shoals that can provide large-scale physical relief and complexities that are important for finfish and invertebrates, as well as, as Colleen mentioned, prime fishing grounds, which are designated by the state of New Jersey, and some of these areas overlap with complex and unique benthic features. This area also overlaps with designated Endangered Species Act designated critical habitat for the loggerhead sea turtle and the North Atlantic right whale. And I do want to note that this area is not fully mapped. So there may be additional, so we don't know where all of these sensitive habitats actually exist in this call area. So we do recommend additional habitat surveys prior to leasing. This was done in the Carolina Long Bay wind energy area, which allowed them to, after the WIAs were identified, and allowed them to avoid some areas of concentration of hard bottom through incorporating that mapping effort. Next slide, please. I just want to highlight some particularly important areas that I covered. The Frank R. Lautenberg Coral Protection Area is located in the deep water areas. We did provide extensive comments on this during the Central Atlantic Round 1. We maintain our position that this should be removed from further consideration. It's a protected area that was defined by the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council in 2015 and went into effect in 2017 after an extensive multi-year stakeholder-driven process. And this area protects deep sea corals by restricting bottom fishing in prime coral habitat, as well as preventing future expansion of fishing in less heavily fished areas where corals are known to occur and likely to be present. The Point and Diamond Shoals off North Carolina is another important area. This area has unique biogeography due to the convergence of the Gulf Stream, Virginia Current, and the West Boundary Undercurrent. in acting as an important migratory corridor for highly migratory species and protected species. It's a highly productive area that exhibits high densities of benthic fauna and benthic fishes, 7 times greater than nearby sites. It's designated by the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council as habitat areas of particular concern. And there's areas of high biodiversity that even extend beyond these HAPC designations. We're significantly concerned with potential for future development in this area and potential operational effects if development immediately adjacent to these areas that could influence large-scale regional oceanographic processes. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there is overlap with Endangered Species Act critical habitat for the North Atlantic right whale and the loggerhead sea turtle. Both of these areas, these areas support important life functions for these species, and we do recommend they are avoided. If overlap cannot be avoided, we do recommend a plan be developed and put in place prior to leasing to address potential impacts to critical habitat. Next slide, please. In addition to designated critical habitat, there's over 30 species protected under the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act that occur in the Central Atlantic to call areas. Depending on the cable routes and vessel transits, there may be other ESA and MMPA species or critical habitat that could be affected by development in this area. The call area, particularly the area of the shelf edge and the Gulf Stream split, the area of the point that I've just discussed and just north of Cape Hatteras are very important as they support many life functions for protected species, including migration, foraging, and social behavior. Additionally, there's, in addition to the overlap with right whale critical habitat, the call area entirely overlaps with the primary route that right whales travel to and from calving grounds in the Southeast US. And both of these areas are also biologically important areas. We encourage continued engagement between our agencies on efforts to develop avoidance and mitigation measures to reduce the effects of protected species in their habitats. Next slide, please. The areas also overlap with substantially overlap with important areas for both commercial and recreational fisheries. Key fisheries affected include scallops, menhaden, surf clam, fluke, black sea bass, Atlantic croaker, longfin squid, snapper, and grouper, as well as tuna, swordfish, and shark fleets in the Ilex squid fleet. Many vessels are reliant on these areas for a substantial portion of their annual fishing revenue. Areas between Massachusetts and South Carolina use this area, including ports of New Bedford, Cape May, and Ocean City and Newport News could be affected by development in this area, and we recommend that they be consulted prior to finalizing any lease areas. I know Todd from Virginia provided some fisheries data in his earlier presentation. We are also working with BOEM and NCOS to compile priority fishing habitat data sources and for use in the suitability model, as well as recommended approaches to present and consider this data. And we do recommend areas of high fishing be avoided for leasing, as development could also substantially increase impacts of the cumulative impacts, socioeconomic impacts to regional fisheries in terms of annual landing and revenues. So BOEM should consider cumulative effects to regional fisheries when prior to selecting these final areas. We do want to mention that fishermen are concerned not just with the presence of turbines themselves, but also concerned about the export cables transit being sited through important fishing grounds. Next slide, please. So collectively, our science centers conduct a total of 11 long-term fisheries and protected species surveys within the call area too. These surveys support management of fisheries and conservation and the recovery of protected species. These surveys will be impacted by offshore wind development. And if they are not mitigated, this would result in a loss of scientific understanding. It will increase uncertainty in our assessments, which will result in major adverse effects to the American public, the fishing community, trust species populations, and marine ecosystems. To address impacts to wind energy development on scientific surveys, NOAA and BOEM have worked to establish the Northeast Survey Mitigation Strategy in 2022, and we're now working to implement that strategy, and the Southeast Fisheries Science Center is working collaboratively with BOEM to finalize a survey mitigation for the Southeast. The Northeast Survey Mitigation Implementation Team is a collaborative working group between BOEM and NOAA, and it was established to help implement survey mitigation. We have been successfully working with BOEM to institute project-specific survey mitigation requirements, and we are working with developers and BOEM to try and be able to meet these conditions by establishing a regional mechanism so that they can be implemented more efficiently and effectively. And we do recommend that this working group institute requirements earlier in the process, and we start thinking about survey mitigation at the earliest phases, including siting and leasing phase. Next slide, please. So I want to just discuss some of the challenges for identifying for the site identification phase. Really, identification of wind energy areas absent comprehensive baseline data creates challenges for avoiding and minimizing impacts. We're relying on existing data sets that were not necessarily collected for this purpose or at a spatial scale, or not at the spatial scale for understanding offshore wind effects. There's also a number of scientific unknowns, particularly related to operational effects, and this creates challenges for understanding how to site to best avoid and minimize impacts. This is particularly concerning given the unique oceanographic processes that occur in this area, and additionally a lack of understanding of technology, particularly floating technology, and what those impacts may be, and how to consider that in siting anything in deep water areas. We're also limited in our understanding of cumulative effects, and it's a challenge to consider cumulative effects since it's occurring at the regulatory phase, at the project-specific phase. But I think a robust cumulative analysis at this phase would help inform the siting process. Lastly, the ocean environment is not static. And this is an example. I don't know if you can get it to showing up on your screen there, but this is an example of giant manta ray sightings, and it demonstrates how the timing and frequencies of these observations are variable, both seasonally and interannually. Animals move seasonally and conditions change. So species distribution shifts complicate our understanding of impacts, and how to best advise on the siting process that really focuses on identifying static boundaries in a dynamic environment. Next slide, please. So recommendations to try and address some of these challenges. Region-wide ecosystem-based monitoring program and the development and implementation of that to help understand the effects of offshore wind development on the ocean environment is critical. This includes baseline monitoring, standard requirements for pre, during, and post-construction, and the implementation of survey mitigation early in the process so we can continue these long-term research and monitoring data sets on our outer continental shelf and understand changes to inform management. This can also help address a number of the scientific uncertainties around offshore wind, including wind wake effects and operations. We also need to gain a better understanding of some of the technologies and impacts of those technologies. So taking the time and effort and resources to invest in better understanding the impacts of different technologies. Additionally, conducting broad-scale cumulative analysis of offshore wind development on the OCS to inform the siting process. So we can consider cumulative effects early in the process to help inform the siting and not just taking a look at this at the project scale. We do recommend that these programs be in place prior to leasing, and absent this information, we really need to we really recommend implementing the precautionary principle when it comes to siting, and that this is important to both minimize large-scale impacts to the ecosystem and reduce conflicts later in the at the regulatory process phase. And also we need to consider, what the scientific unknowns are and consider ways in the siting process to actually reduce risks based on those unknowns. Really understanding the effects and impacts of fisheries and protected species prior to large-scale leasing and development could reduce the risk to these resources and the fishing communities that rely on them, and increase certainty in our ability to address our climate change mitigation goals. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'm just going to cover some lessons learned. Based on our experience, we expect that once these areas are leased, we will see proposals for full build out. So to really help streamline the process, it's in everyone's interest and benefit to really get the high conflict areas removed at this early stage. That includes areas of high biodiversity, sensitive habitats, critical habitats, designated protected areas, and important fishing grounds that are more vulnerable to impacts. We're actively working with BOEM and NCOS to identify data sets to inform the suitability model. But want to point out that modeling is one tool to help inform this decision-making process, and it should be supplemented with additional qualitative and quantitative assessments and data and input from affected stakeholders. The Gulf of Mexico shrimp fishery serves as an example of how additional input from stakeholders is paramount to minimizing conflicts. And it's important for BOEM to articulate how both the scientific data sets and policy decisions are incorporated into the leasing identification process and the final decisions on wind energy areas. The call areas are focused on lease areas, but impacts will also occur during transmission from energy to shore. And this can result in extensive impacts, particularly if routes are not coordinated and impacts are not consolidated. Additionally, scientific uncertainties do not equal no impacts and really should be considered at this early site identification phase. Uncertainties that are not addressed before leasing really need to be considered in this process, and steps to reduce the risks to resources given these uncertainties should be an important component of this siting process. This may include incorporation of adequate buffers and setbacks from sensitive areas to minimize impacts from operational effects. Even with all the steps we may take at this point in the process to try and minimize conflicts, it's also important to acknowledge that additional measures of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation will be necessary beyond the siting process. And we do recommend that avoidance minimization strategies be considered early and often throughout the process. And this early coordination on this should really focus on how to best avoid impacts first. So with that, NIMS is committed to working with BOEM to address these challenges and information needs and identify the available data sources and provide technical support to inform the process and help minimize conflicts with marine resources and our fishing communities. So next slide. That's all I have. I wanted to just put some contact information for my colleagues from both of our regions and science centers and regional offices. So thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks for that presentation. As with the state presentations, we're going to roll through the three presentations we have now, and the next one is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So you all are up next, and I think, Glenn, you're going to be, Glenn Smith is, there you are. Excellent. So Glenn, let me just turn it over to you and let me know when to advance your slides.
Okay, thank you. I'm Glenn Smith. I'm the Assistant Regional Endangered Species Coordinator for the Northeastern 13 states, and I'll be presenting on behalf of a team of several of our programs here in the region. Next slide, please. So portions of the call area will overlap with several bird and bat species listed or proposed to be listed under the Endangered Species Act in both the offshore and onshore environments. And as we'll see in a minute, there is also significant activity in portions of the CA2 call area by birds protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And finally, our national wildlife refuges have numerous trust resources and regulatory intersection with the offshore wind industry in the CA2 call area. Next slide, please. Multiple federally listed species are present in the Central Atlantic 2 call area during various stages of their life history, including the piping plover, the roofer red knot, the black-capped petrel, the Bermuda petrel, and the roseate tern. The service is currently working to provide BOEM with specific data layers addressing these areas to be used in future modeling efforts. So for the purposes of this talk, we'll highlight general areas of concern. Piping plovers nest along coastal beaches, highlighted here in the orange, and tracking research has also shown that they will move between these locations throughout the nesting season, putting them within the west side of the call area. They've also been documented moving through this call area during the southern migratory journey as well. The western side of the call area is also where red knots migrate. The Delaware Bay and eastern shore of Virginia are well known, an extremely important stopover and staging sites for the red knots, where thousands are observed every spring on their northward migration. The roseate tern is also occasionally observed in a coastal environment along the call area and occupies this area during its migration and nesting habitat north of the call area. Next slide, please. Petrels, which are pelagic seabirds, meaning they spend a large portion of their lives on the open ocean, are known to use the Gulf Stream, which comes close to the shore in North Carolina and where most occurrences have been documented. This figure shows the range of both the light and dark morphs of the black-capped petrel, and you can see that they are most likely to be encountered in the eastern portions of the call area and in proximity to North Carolina. The locations within this call area where there's greatest concern for listed species include the western, eastern, Cape Hatteras portions of the call area. When completing Section 7 consultations on any lease area, the service uses the best available scientific and commercial data when analyzing impacts of species. So keep in mind that more information may be available at the time of consultation. Next slide, please. One group of bats potentially impacted by offshore development use coastal environments to roost, forage, raise pups, and hibernate. These ESA listed and proposed species affected by white nose syndrome can be impacted by landfall activities, including tree clearing and other habitat modification. Well, these bats have been documented offshore. The greatest concern is for the landfall activity. The other group of bats in the call area are tree bats that don't hibernate, but instead migrate to warmer areas. Migratory tree bats occur offshore, sometimes in large numbers. And while none of the migratory bats are currently listed, one species, the hoary bat, is on the ESA listing plan for evaluation in 2028 due to population declines associated with terrestrial wind energy production. Studies have shown that bats appear to be attracted to wind turbines and spend time interacting with them or examining them. And some species are highly susceptible to mortality through collisions with turbine blades. The motivations behind these behaviors are still an area of active research. Acoustic surveys, mist-net surveys, and tracking studies are needed to understand the risks bats from offshore wind development. Further investment in MODIS and tracking technology are also needed to fill the gaps. Next slide, please. Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, prohibits take of protected migratory bird species without prior authorization by the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Central Atlantic 2 call area overlaps with migratory corridors for land birds, shore birds, and marine birds, as well as important pelagic habitats for breeding and overwintering marine birds. The impacts to individual species will depend on siting of wind development and the life history of the species, with siting likely being the most important factor in impacts to migratory birds. The potential impact to birds by offshore wind development include direct mortality via collision, habitat loss and displacement, and barrier effects causing increased energetic costs both during migration and or breeding while avoiding the wind farms. Development of bay mouths, areas of upwelling, migratory corridors, and the water surrounding waterbird nesting colonies will increase the risk of negative impacts to birds from wind development infrastructure. The Delaware Bay is one of the many important shorebird stopover sites in the region, and siting of wind infrastructure in those migratory pathways to and from these areas could cause negative population level impacts to these species. Here are a few maps illustrating some of our main concerns. The map on the top right shows marine bird nesting colonies along the coast adjacent to the call area, with an arrow showing potential foraging distances for some species. The map on the bottom right shows the Central Atlantic region, and the lines indicate that the tracks of tagged birds. You can see that there's a lot of bird movement going on in this area, highlighting our concern for wind energy siting in this region. The third map on the bottom left shows how the Chesapeake Bay and Baymouth are known to be high-use areas by marine birds. We're working with BOEM and the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science to minimize potential impacts of wind energy development on birds to the greatest degree possible by providing data maps of the best available information, to encouraging siting of projects in the least impactful locations and minimizing the amount of potential mitigation required from developers. Next slide, please. The National Historic Preservation Act, or NHPA, requires federal agencies to consider the effects of proposed federal undertakings on historic properties. This includes the government-to-government relationship, the services government-to-government relationship with their tribal partners, which requires consultation to understand impacts to important resources. Traditional cultural properties identified by the tribes are significant resources that require consultation and thoughtful consideration prior to impact. Refuges with traditional cultural properties are legally obligated to ensure that avoidance, minimization, or mitigation occurs from those potential impacts, and this is completed in concert with the tribal partners. Next slide, please. National wildlife refuges represent many trust resources. They're home to critical habitat for endangered species and migratory birds, pristine Class 1 wildernesses, and traditional cultural properties for tribes. Many refuges have multiple trust resources. One example is Back Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which not only has critical habitat and wilderness, but is also in consideration for traditional cultural property designation for the Nansemond Indian Nation. These trust resources come with additional permitting requirements for development projects. Offshore wind energy can impact these resources through blade collisions, transmission line landfall, air pollution during construction, and impacts to visual resources. Each refuge has a responsibility to ensure that activities do not interfere with the establishing purpose of that refuge. The Federal Land Managers Air Quality Related Values Group, or FLAG, was formed by the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service to evaluate air pollution effects on air quality related values in federal Class 1 wilderness areas as defined by the Clean Air Act. Next slide. In summary, what we presented today represents the most significant resource challenges we have. Excuse me. We have in the permitting process. Several of these concerns have been raised previously during the review process for Central Atlantic 1 siting. And information deficiencies exist related to several species, including listed species, and thus a continued need to collect additional data to fill these gaps to better inform impact assessment. We're currently developing data products to inform the development areas, and we'll need to work closely with BOEM throughout the permitting process to ensure we're properly protecting our resources. And that's it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate the presentation. Great. So next up, we have the National Park Service, and I saw Kristen come off. Kristen, are you going to lead us in, or is Dusty going to?
Yep, I'll do it.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Andel, and I'm the Energy Specialist for Interior Region 1 of the National Park Service. I serve as the primary coordinator for the Northeast region regarding renewable energy projects as they relate to potential impacts to NPS resources, and act as the primary contact for BOEM for projects in the Northeast region, which includes 83 sites in 13 states spanning from Maine to Virginia. So also on the call with me today is my counterpart, Dusty Pate, Energy Specialist for the Southeast region, which includes 73 parks, including those in the Carolinas. Next slide, please. So the NPS mission is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Organic Act of 1916 established the NPS as an agency under the DOI and set forth the agency's mission as the steward of the nation's parklands. So we work to fulfill our mission by supporting DOI and national energy goals consistent with management responsibilities. Next slide. While the NPS supports the development of alternative energy sources and the related overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, our primary obligation is to protect park resources and values pursuant to the NPS Organic Act and other laws, regulations, and policies. The context in which we manage units of the national park system and programs includes all the legislation here and much more. So NPS unit enabling legislation is the instrument that establishes the purposes, boundaries, and operation conditions that apply to a specific unit of the park system. The NPS General Authorities Act requires the NPS to manage the national park system as a whole. So all areas of the national park system are managed in the same fundamental way, regardless of whether they are a national park, a national seashore, or some other designation. And the NPS has an important advisory role in the administration of the National Historic Preservation Act. So if an action has the potential to affect a historic property, including national historic landmarks, then the Section 106 process must be completed. National historic landmarks are nationally significant historic properties that illustrate or commemorate the history and prehistory of the United States. And related areas are linked in importance and purpose to the places managed directly by the NPS by preserving important segments of the nation's natural and cultural heritage. So related areas include national heritage areas, wild and scenic rivers, and many other designations. And NPS also administers the National Natural Landmarks Program, which supports and encourages the conservation of our nation's best examples of the natural landscape. Next slide. NPS also administers the Land and Water Conservation, or LWCF, State and Local Assistance Program. The LWCF provides matching grants to states and through states to local governments and federally recognized tribal governments for acquisition and development of public outdoor recreation areas and facilities. So in addition to providing financial assistance, a permanent legacy of outdoor recreation resources is established under these grants. Designated wilderness areas under the Wilderness Act are jointly managed by NPS and other federal agencies. So NPS considers whether a renewable energy project located adjacent to protected wilderness areas will alter the air quality, ambient sound level, dark night sky, or tamper with the natural condition of the wilderness area. And the Park Service is one of the 4 federal land managing agencies with wild and scenic river management responsibilities. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act authorizes Congress to preserve certain rivers with outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values in a free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. Next slide, please. So as directed by the legislation in the previous slides, the Park Service has responsibility over parks and special status areas such as those listed here. These are just some examples of park system units, related areas, and numerous programs that are potentially affected by offshore wind energy development. So we work with other agencies and developers to ensure consideration of park resources and values in these areas. Next slide. NPS roles and responsibilities related to offshore wind include providing advice, comments, and resource protection recommendations through NEPA and NHPA. We do this by evaluating purpose and need for the action to ensure it considers NPS resources, evaluate whether the range of alternatives are developed to consider the impacts to NPS resources, advise BOEM on the level of analysis to ensure the impacts are fully considered, and recommend mitigation measures. The NPS has the authority to issue right-of-way permits for utilities and infrastructure as long as they are compatible with the public interest and there would be minimal impacts to park resources, visitor experience, and safety. So for this reason, NPS only issues right-of-way permits when there is no practicable alternative to use the lands and waters within a system unit. Construction activities under a special use permit must also avoid or minimize impacts to system unit resources and values. And the NPS also has discretion in whether to approve an LWCF conversion on state or local lands where we have provided grant funds supporting recreational uses. So while the states determine if the site's a conversion, approval and compliance on the replacement property is under NPS authority. So in the case of connected onshore cables coming ashore at parks or LWCF sites, close coordination is necessary, and ensuring these types of proposals are evaluated in site-specific detail under NEPA is very important. And we also acknowledge our interagency role under FAST 41. Next slide, please. One of the goals of the National Park Service is to ensure the fundamental purposes for which park units are created by Congress, as outlined in their enabling legislation, are protected as Congress intended. Some of the fundamental resources and values that could be at risk from offshore wind development near or within park units are shown on the next few slides. So common concerns include visual impacts, including dark night sky impacts, as well as habitat and visitor experience. And so Park Foundation documents summarize fundamental purposes for each park system unit. Next slide. So soundscapes and water quality would largely be issues associated with transmission crossing NPS units. So impacts to fish, wildlife, and habitat may also be due to transmission crossings within NPS units, but are also possible beyond park boundaries. Populations of fish or wildlife that move in and out of parks may be affected by offshore wind development nearby, and that includes populations of listed species where NPS supports recovery efforts, often substantially. Next slide. Many parks protect globally unique geologic features and natural processes. For example, coastal parks rely on complex natural systems to maintain shorelines. Offshore wind development may affect these features and shoreline dynamics. And finally, providing for visitor experience is an important part of the NPS mission pursuant to the Organic Act and unit enabling legislation. Visitors have high expectations when visiting park units, and offshore wind development can alter these experiences. Next slide. So the Central Atlantic 2 call area includes multiple national park system units, including national seashores, historic sites, wilderness areas, land and water conservation fund assistance sites, and national register properties, including national historic landmarks, national natural landmarks, where the NPS has jurisdiction or special expertise. So this is a list of some of the units that are in the call area. And as we've looked at in the previous slides, the visual landscape is one of the most important resources associated with coastal parks. Along with that is preserving nationally significant and special cultural and natural features, including the ambience that characterizes the seashore. Scenic views, including the night skies, as we've been discussing, are an important feature in national parks, and often those views transcend park boundaries. So these coastal parks also feature high levels of recreation use from visitors, as recreation is one of the primary purposes for each park. So some lessons, next slide, please. Thanks. Lessons learned and ideas to continue to successfully and more efficiently engage include communication. So fostering communication early in the planning process and throughout the life of the project really helps to establish and maintain frequent communication channels for accurate and timely information sharing. That includes project updates, challenges, and alignments on shared goals. So I'm the NPS lead coordinating our work on the Central Atlantic 2 lease planning, and then Dusty and I take the lead for coordinating Atlantic offshore wind projects in our respective regions, so the Northeast and Southeast regions. Another lesson learned is visual simulation. So while they have limitations, they're really helpful for us and stakeholders to understand the potential impact of offshore wind development on resources and values in areas where we have jurisdiction and special expertise. So early coordination with us is also important for those simulations to have the most value for our interests. And another lesson learned is the challenge of technological change and changes in the potential impacts over time. So our assumptions in the lease planning process may not, and in some cases have not, kept up with the changes in the industry, particularly the size of wind turbine generators when the projects are proposed for development. And next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, last slide. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this planning process, and we look forward to continued collaboration. You can reach Dusty or I or me at the emails provided on this slide. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks all of our 3 sets of presenters here from National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife, and NOAA Fisheries. I'm going to go ahead and drop the slides for now, and always happy to pull them back up. Like we had with the state presenters, happy to have some questions thrown in the chat. If folks have some task force members, excuse me, have some questions in the chat, we're just pulling folks up and pinning them on the screen as well, if you're surprised while you're up there. So again, this is an opportunity. If you have some questions, throw them in the chat. If you have a comment, feel free to raise your hand. And if you're a task force member, we'll do that again. If you're just joining us for some reason, we're going to do public input tomorrow. We're sticking with the main conversation here with the task force members of our public officials. So when you heard NOAA Fisheries, Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service describe the way they're thinking about this Central Atlantic 2 process, any questions come to mind? Any comment that you have? Happy to do that in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand as well for our 3 presenters here. Any questions or comments? All very clear, apparently. I'll just give it a second more. It seems your presentations were quite clear. I see a hand from Naomi. And so Charlotte, can you make sure Naomi can unmute herself?
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Naomi Handel. I'm the Regulatory Program Manager at the Corps of Engineers North Atlantic Division. My question I would direct first towards Sue, but then any of the others could answer if they have a response. I'm wondering, you went over, you presented a lot of areas and different types of resources that you would need to be, or would be desired to be protected. Can you think of any examples of successful avoidance of similar type areas in the other regions that are already further along in wind? And if so, are there ways that those were achieved that could be applied here? Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Sue, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I also encourage some of our colleagues on the panel to speak up, but I know in the Southeast region, I think we used one of these examples in terms of the shrimp fishery. There was a lot of stakeholder engagement in that has worked to help deconflict that fishery. And we're working with BOEM in the Gulf of Maine, and as well as the Central Atlantic one. So we've been, there are a lot of resources in the area, and that's why we're still in the process of compiling all the data sets and basically providing input to BOEM and NCOS in terms of how to consider those data sets and how to prioritize data sets and getting a better understanding of how they may be affected in the model. So yes, we're still working on that, but there have been, I think, again, I think encouraging stakeholder engagement and getting areas removed is really an important piece as well.
Thanks, Sue. Kristen, Glenn, anything to add to that in terms of what's been learned in other processes in terms of avoidance?
Sure. I can add, our experience with the Gulf of Maine planning process was, working early with BOEM on the visual simulations. So that was one thing that I think was a really good collaboration, and doing that really early in the process.
Thanks, Kristen.
And I think same thing for Fish and Wildlife Service. We had some good input on the main siting procedure. And I don't know if any of my colleagues from the Southeast region are on, but I thought I'd heard that there was some success in siting down there for future projects.
Okay. So anyone else from Fish and Wildlife who wants to jump in on that?
Christine and Stephanie.
Christine's here. Charlie, can you make sure Christine can jump in quickly right now?
I think you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, we were able to provide quite a bit of information about coastal birds in the Gulf of Mexico, and we were very happy with how the siting went as far as avoiding some of the higher impacts. So.
Thanks, Christine. Okay, wonderful. Before I jump to Stephanie's hand, I'm just going to say from the chat, there's a comment specifically, Sue, to you about, could you restate the timeline for the BOEM NIMS Southeast Survey Mitigation Plan? And did you say
I'm gonna let John Walters take that question. He's on the panel as well. He's from the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and he can probably better answer that question.
John, are you available to answer that question right now, either in chat or verbally?
David, I am. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope we can hear me all right. I'm the Deputy Director for Science and Council Services at Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and we are in the final stages of finishing the draft survey mitigation plan with BOEM and us for the Southeast. That's going to need to go through the internal review processes at both of our jurisdictions. We think that's probably something that could get out early in the new year. We think probably early in FY or in probably 2025. So pretty soon. We think it'll take a couple of weeks for the review process, but we anticipate it to be imminent. And my other comment, I will comment about some of the things that were successful in the Gulf of Mexico. And I know for birds, the exclusion up to 20 nautical miles from shore was done in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf was fairly successful in siting, in large part because it started so large that there was a lot of real estate to work from to deconflict among many of the different trust resources. I think the challenge we're facing here is that it's a smaller, tighter spatial area with a lot of different resources that are all potentially using this area, from birds, fisheries, fish, mammals. And so I think it's going to be the challenge of finding the right areas for wind, avoiding areas that are more problematic. And that's really the essence of the marine spatial planning and how it worked. And I'm glad that we're starting big here in this region, because I think that allows us to start big, to finish big, to find the right places. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Let me grab Stephanie Vale's hand. Stephanie, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hey everyone. Apologies for the delayed come on. So this is more of a question towards Sue and Glenn, and I think it's like really important because we recognize that we have an audience right now to kind of highlight the strengths of having really good Section 7 or baseline data for listed species, and the potential permitting issues that could come down the line if we don't have that in order to make really good siting decisions. And so my question is what are the challenges that y'all could foresee having when it comes to the permitting process in the future if we don't have some really good baseline data to make smart siting decisions on to use for this process? And are there ways that the public or the states or other groups could help us kind of identify the data that's available out there, or that they could pursue to help us with these decisions?
Stephanie, could you just introduce yourself quickly, if you don't mind?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm Stephanie Vale Muse. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services Ecological Services out of headquarters. I'm the National Offshore Wind Coordinator.
Super. Thanks, Stephanie. Panelists, thoughts on that good question from Stephanie? You're on mute, Sue, if you're trying to jump in. Wait. For some reason, it's not coming off mute.
Mute. There it goes. All right, sorry. I'm trying to keep myself muted while others are talking. I can start, and thanks, Stephanie, for that question. It's a good question. I mean, I think the challenge of not having the baseline information, it could really, it creates challenges that could not only like delay future regulatory processes, but also could result in what otherwise may have been avoidable impacts to resources. I mean, I think a lot more thought and data is going into identifying these upcoming lease areas. I know initially in the Greater Atlantic region, areas were identified, did not have the model or all the data sets, and that creates challenges, both for project by project, we're trying to address resource conflicts, and it's very challenging because at that point, again, like I think I said, like we are expecting full build out, which I think is something that we were not possibly expecting when the early wind energy areas were identified. So, and I know I mentioned the scientific uncertainty related to operational effects and a lot of research that's coming out about potential wind wake effects. And that's why even if we don't have, there's still a lot of unknowns on effects. And I think those should be prioritized so that we can, and considered in this process in terms of ensuring that we have, information where we can feel confident that impacts are minimized. But again, like you said, in terms of getting to the, we consider it more critical to address these issues head on at this early phase so that they're not then punted to a project by project phase. It's much more challenging at that end to get areas reduced and to get, particularly given that there's very tight timelines around those. So to avoid delays and to avoid headaches down the future and otherwise avoidable impacts, I think this is a really important step in the process that folks need to pay attention to, and we need to incorporate all the best available information and identify and consider areas where we don't have a lot of data and what that might mean. But we would like to see a lot more data and information kind of collected earlier in the process.
Thanks, Sue.
I agree, Sue. Both of us implementing Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, and throughout the Endangered Species Act, the information requirement is best available scientific commercial data, and that doesn't mean we have good data, but we have to make determinations based on what's available. And when there's not much available, it bakes in a lot of uncertainty into the process. And since we're dealing with species threatened with extinction, uncertainty could lead to bad results on the one side, or could lead to conservation measures that aren't really needed because of we don't have sufficient information. The other real difficult thing with offshore wind, especially for the species the service is looking at, really hard to monitor. We're not going to find many seabirds or bats in the open ocean after a collision. So that's a huge, huge challenge that we've never encountered before, and how to monitor. And monitoring oftentimes helps you tighten up your conservation measures and determines whether the impacts are higher or lower than you thought, and allows you to make adjustments over time. But that's going to be a real challenge in the offshore environment.
Thanks, Glenn. Great. Anything else? Task force members? questions, thoughts, reactions for your federal agency partners here? Yeah, I'll just give it one more second. Okay. Well, I'll say thank you to our three presenters here. And thanks for folks for good questions there. And appreciate the thought that's gone into this. So
Thanks.
the last thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about next steps. I will invite Seth Tierkoff back to lead that, and I know that some others from BOEM may want to weigh in as well. So Seth, I'll follow your lead in terms of throwing up slides, or what would you like me to do to get us into this final section? And if we end a little early, I don't think anyone's going to shed any tears. Seth, just let me know what you'd like in terms of your slides.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. No slides for this portion. Just wanted to take a moment here and really express gratitude to our particular state and federal agency colleagues that presented and spent time preparing presentations and joining the discussions today. I know that was a lot of information, and I think that hopefully conveys to you all just the magnitude of information and considerations that BOEM will be considering as this process moves forward. And we really intend, as the process moves forward, to balance those considerations as we move this process forward. David Diamond, who's our Deputy Chief for Atlantic Operations, and he offered some introductory remarks earlier today, is going to be sharing a little bit in terms of some of his findings from our conversation today. So Dave, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. Oh, thanks a lot, Seth. Yeah. I was just kind of taking a few notes during the presentations and just had a couple thoughts just to kind of offer maybe my own perspective on the discussions this morning and kind of the implications for the overall process, and to kind of frame the way ahead in people's minds as we go forward with additional presentations and comment opportunities tomorrow. So first of all, just wanted to say I really appreciate all the different perspectives offered so far by the different task force members today, including the state representatives, Senator Carroza, and our federal partners that we just heard from as well. I think all those remarks have kind of highlighted the importance of both a further lease into meeting state goals, but also pointed out there's a lot of important concerns we have to deal with. And in particular, I think the presentations we just had from NOAA Fisheries, from Fish and Wildlife, and National Park Service just highlighted a lot of concerns by additional members of our own federal family that we work with all the time. And we'll hear from other federal partners tomorrow, and I'm sure they're going to highlight additional concerns that we need to be cognizant of, and we'll work through as we move further through the planning process. With that in mind, though, just wanted to reemphasize that this is just the beginning of a multi-stage, multi-year planning process. We know there are concerns and resource conflicts we need to work through, just as we did for the Central Atlantic 1 leasing process, which was a multi-year process leading up to the sale we just had back in August. Something else to keep in mind, as Seth highlighted during his presentation, we've included a very expansive call area. Now, specifically to get as much information as possible, even though we really don't anticipate leasing in some of the areas that were included. A good example of that is the fact that we included areas as close as the 3-mile state federal boundary, even though we've never leased that close to shore before. But we still want to get information on those areas, so we'll be able to compare that information and to information from areas further out, and have like a complete look picture of all the resources and activities in the call area, in those near shore areas as well as the further out areas. And so if we didn't include the near shore areas, we wouldn't get information on them necessarily. So that's why they're in there. I think that applies for other areas that have been considered before and taken off the table, but we've we've included them just to try to get a relook and have the benefit of newer information. And in response to the call, I think we are going to get a lot of information that's been provided previously, but I hope and expect we'll also get new information from additional studies and monitoring that have occurred since we looked at these areas in the previous call several years ago. And I think several of our speakers just highlighted the new information and studies that have been done just in the last couple of years that we didn't have the benefit of previously. Yeah, and with this new and updated information, I think that'll allow us to really be informed during the next steps in the process, and that's when we fully expect to winnow down the call area dramatically as we move to identify specific wind energy areas and get to the actual lease areas that we'll offer during the sale. And finally, if you look back at the Central Atlantic 1 process, I think that's exactly what happened. We started off with a very large call area, and we winnowed that down to really only 2 lease areas that were offered in the sale this past August. So it's an important, that winnowing process is important, and it really I think the idea is to really, we go large in the call, get as much area much information as possible, and that helps us winnow those areas down as we move through and get to an actual sale. So just wanted to offer that perspective, and then open it back up to any other colleagues from BOEM or task force members to provide any additional kind of closing remarks or thoughts.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, this is an opportunity, folks on the task force. If you have some follow-up questions for BOEM or others, we have a few minutes here. Just I'll open it up if folks from the task force have some follow-up things. I'll also pull up a slide in just a moment to give a little preview of what tomorrow's going to look like. And before I do that, though, just quick check either in the chat or raise a hand if you have a question for BOEM based on today's conversation. Okay. Great. Seth, would you like me to pull up a slide, and would you like me to walk through tomorrow, or happy to?
That would be great, David. Yeah, and the intent there is just to really orient folks to day 2, tomorrow's conversation, which will be the second day of our task force meeting here.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, so here's the slide that I showed earlier today with the agenda for today and tomorrow. Tomorrow, just as a reminder, we'll hear from Department of Defense, Coast Guard, and NASA. Again, key federal partners for this area in the Central Atlantic. We're going to dive into some key issues. And here, Seth, I wonder if you want to just give a heads up what some of those key issues are so people get an understanding what that means on the slide here. Can you just give a, the short preview of what those key things are?
Yeah, the intent with that session is really to provide folks an overview of how BOEM will be partnering with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science to further develop and refine the spatial model that was part of the Central Atlantic 1 process. And again, that model really was built upon the foundation of information and feedback that we received through that Central Atlantic 1 process. So our intent in that session is really to get folks onto the same page with that spatial modeling process, and then to dive a little bit deeper into a few key issue areas that we're aware of from Central Atlantic 1 that we are going to be needing to address as the Central Atlantic 2 process moves forward. So that'll touch on some fisheries, habitat, as well as viewshed related issues.
Super. Thanks, Seth. So that should be pretty interesting because it'll really dive into some content around things where it'll be very helpful for the task force, you all, and other actors to provide information. As I mentioned previously, tomorrow we're going to have a period of time. We're scheduling an hour. If we don't need that much, we won't use it. If we will use it for public input. So if you're joining us today, I hope you come back tomorrow. And if you have input you'd like to provide to the task force and to BOEM, that's an opportunity to do it. And then we'll round up tomorrow. Again, we aim to end at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Today, we're going to end a little early. But I wouldn't say that that's definitely what will happen tomorrow as well. So that's the outlook for tomorrow. I think that's all I have. Seth or Dave Diamond, anything else on your end before we finish up today?
No, I just wanted to thank you, David and Seth again. So it was a lot to you. I think you guys were on camera for almost 4 hours straight. So just really appreciate all the work that went into this first day and look forward to a equally successful second day as well.
Thank you, Dave. And I just want to echo the gratitude to all of the task force members, as well as particularly the states and federal agencies that presented today. There was quite a bit of preparation work that went into sharing those presentations, and we know a lot of that content's also going to be in the formal comments that will come from the states and federal agencies as part of the call comment period. So really appreciate that and look forward to more tomorrow.
Wonderful. Okay. So with that, I'm just going to drop in the chat again my colleague Charlotte's email. If you are having any technical difficulty today, if you didn't make it up into the main meeting room here and you're a task force member, I apologize. Something happened there. Good. Oh, Charlotte dropped it in as well. Thanks, Charlotte. Reach out to Charlotte and we can sort that out for tomorrow. Thanks everyone for your time. We'll end here and we'll see you back here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all so much.